let me preface these remarks with I never, ever believe Israeli figures. I've been in the government too long to know that the Israelis are patent liars in their intelligence community, in their propaganda community, certainly, and in their leadership. They are inveterate liars.
Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours.
Tuesday, June 18, 2024. Thank you for joining me tonight. Important show to cover. I actually was planning on a much longer show. There's a lot of stuff I had, a lot of the typical stuff we get into, kind of following up on the conversations, the developments and ceasefire conversations, the humanitarian aid, a lot of developments kind of like of the day. And I'm almost going to guarantee that I'll be getting to that, at least trying to, early tomorrow, but getting to it tomorrow. And I still have that Internet of Body overlap that I'm going to do at some point off to the side. Today's timing got a little bit skewed. I was going to be doing an interview earlier with Kim Iverson, and we were forced to reschedule. And so I kind of threw my timing off. And so long story short, I've had this building on the side. I've talked many times about the October 7th documentary that I wanted to kind of watch along. And just with so much going on, I haven't had the time. You know, every day I get to sit down to do a show, there's so much else to cover that I haven't got a chance to do it. So today, because of a new development on the foreknowledge aspect of October 7th, which is really not new information, as I'll highlight some of our even subscribers on Twitter have been really on this story from a long time ago. We're going to break down that conversation and why it's not new and go through the foreknowledge and the information around it using these documentaries. Big shout out to the people that have done, there's about 3 or 4 different, short and longer versions of different documentaries and clips that we're going to highlight. And I really feel like, I think all of you are very well aware of the overwhelming amount of foreknowledge, which that's not even the deep part of what we're going to get into. I think that's so wildly public. It's interesting. We're just going to focus on the newer part of the development. And now it's even being admitted, so it kind of will prove itself. But we'll talk about the Hannibal Directive. And it really, I think, as well as say, this conversation is very well known, very disputed, right? In a lot of different circles, we'll argue different things. But I haven't seen anybody put all of these different things that are out there in one spot. I'm sure it's happened, but I thought it would be good use of the time tonight to kind of line this stuff up. It could end up being somewhat as long as we're used to, but I think this will most likely be shorter because of the limited focus. But some of these documentaries, the one at the end, I'm probably not going to play all of it. It's about an hour. So we're only going to get into the overview of it and play that. And, who knows, maybe we'll end up watching the whole thing at the end of the show today. But I really think it's important that we kind of make sure, for those that might still be on the fence. That's why I titled this The Undeniable Reality of the Foreknowledge of October 7th. And I'll give you my opinions, many of which I've already given over the 9-month period of why I think what's most likely in regard to who might have allowed something. Was it completely just caught off guards? Were they unawares? There's a lot of different narratives. And then in regard to whether, whatever you think went down on October 7th, whether there was an allowance, some parts of the government allowed it, they all did. After that, the amount of evidence around Hannibal Directive, and let's just even argue whether or not that was a stated directive that was ordered, the amount of evidence of how many, look, let's put it this way, actually. If the Hannibal Directive was not ordered, it makes it a hell of a lot worse. The idea that so many Israeli IDF soldiers killed their own people on that day and afterward with the hostages and detainees in Gaza, I've never seen anything like it. And it really does give you an insight into what the mindset is of these IDF members, the Israeli government, in particular, the Zionist organization running it all, that they would be willing to do that. And I think it's important to make sure we all see how clear this really is and let that reflect on the bigger story, on what they're currently doing to people that aren't their people, and what they're still currently doing to the people that are in Gaza that they claim they're trying to protect. It's powerful. It's horrifying. So let's go through this all. and put it together as best we can. And you can look forward to a much more nuanced show about all these different, developing conversations and new points, one of which is about the humanitarian aid situation, which is just even more and more, and overlapping with the ceasefire, getting just absurdly obvious. But this is one of the things I brought over to the show today because of a more detailed aspect of the UN overview of aid and kind of crossings and so on. I discovered something that I aligned with this that really caught my attention in regard to the interesting decline, specifically in all kinds of fuel right before October 7th. I mean, the almost, it's striking, which to me adds very clearly to the amount of evidence that they knew something was coming. And this was more so about, because we know that's coming, if that's the case, that we're going to get ahead of this in regard to the fuel aspect. And that, again, whether that's all, some part of it, it's up for you to decide. So let's start today with this obvious discussion that has been circulating as of yesterday, which is by no means a new conversation. Business Insider. Israeli military knew how Hamas planned to take hostages weeks before October 7th. This is a report, and this is citing a report that was put out. We'll read through it. I feel like it was... Anyway, we'll read through it. The point, though, is that this is not just about that they knew, but specific details. Again, hear me on this, none of which is new information, which is kind of incredible to me. Oh, it was the New York Times. In fact, it put this out in December, I think, about Operation Jericho Wall. And that this is about them having specific numbers even of how many hostages they were going to take, which you could argue still would be, whether or not there's a coordination with Hamas in all of this is another question we should ask. Knowing the funding of Hamas through Israel, I still argue that it's not as simple as just one or the other at this point. I think it's, if anything, it's both. There's still elements of Hamas that are in some way beholden to either, Qatar to Israel, or, some element outside of what they're actually fighting for in regard to the Palestinian resistance, as well as some that have grown up there and worked through that group and being the only aspect or only outlet they may have to fight for their resistance, one of a few anyway. So my point is that has changed a lot. But whether or not you think that they were involved is a valid question. My point, though, is that if they knew exactly how many hostages they were going to take, if this is actually accurate, which I do think it is, it seems to suggest either, and again, you could argue it was about how many hostages they wanted to exchange them for, right? But knowing how many are actually held, thousands and thousands without charge for indefinite periods of time in Israel, you could argue they would likely take more than that, or plan to anyway. And I think it's interesting that this highlights something that the Israeli government would allow, the amount of knowledge they had around it. So it starts on, and this was posted on June 17th, yesterday. The Israeli military knew about Hamas's plans to attack southern Israel weeks before October 7th, even how many hostages the militant group planned to capture, according to a report. And this is coming through the Israeli broadcaster Kan. It says the Israeli Defense Forces Gaza Division reportedly distributed an internal intelligence document on September 19th, 2023, outlining the details of Hamas's planned raid according to this platform. And we'll show you this is directly publicly being put out on their platforms. Right there alone, I find this so interesting. Ask yourself, why would they detail this plan? Doesn't that sound a lot like the propaganda we're getting from Israel? Oh, look, they've got a 1, 2, 3 step list on how to rape people. Here's their, it doesn't, not, which by the way, has almost all been shown to be outwardly like ludicrously false, making fun of them, like ridicule level false. Not even to say that they're not capable, they're incapable of something like that. It's just so embarrassing that they would fake this stuff with such being so easily disproven. But would they outline this and say, write down the amount? That's just, and personally, doesn't seem very strategic, if you ask my opinion. But it says the document, which Khan reportedly saw, states that the IDF had observed Hamas conducting a series of trainings where militant fighters practiced attacking both Israeli military stations and civilian kibbutzes and communities. Now, this information, again, has been publicly discussed more than once from this platform, but we weren't breaking this story. This was coming from either the New York Times reporting or other people on the ground, the Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, and so on. And the point being that they were being told from their own survey, or the IDF members on the wall. We've talked about this, where they said, we can see them doing X, Y, and Z. And so many times, to the point to which their commanders told them, I'm paraphrasing, I forget the exact words, but we'll push you in jail if you keep stressing this, that it's fake, it's imaginary, crazy, over and over and over. And so the idea that this is new, or that they saw there's some new document that shows this, is it's interesting. This is why a lot of people are arguing, and I agree, that this is a controlled release of information, which most people have already even discussed. Even this is what's interesting, is you can frame this as some kind of a new thing, even though the New York Times has fully broken this down for the most part. The IDF also knew, according to the document viewed by Khan, that they trained its units on how to capture hostages and how to guard them once they were taken back to the Gaza Strip. Now, that I find interesting. That's one of the reasons it stands out to me as likely not a Israeli framing, like the idea that this completely challenges their entire narrative, that it was just rape and murder and pillage, just all hurting, and the only reason they took them is because they were caught. They were trying to get away. And well, no, I think it's obvious whether or not some of that happened, which again, the evidence is not there. And in fact, you could argue it's been proven to not be true. The point is that you could see that their stated plan in many different angles was to take them back to exchange for their own people. And you have more than one video now of them fending off people that, who knows what they were trying to do, but anybody, people of all religions, all faiths, and all ethnicities around the world in certain positions, there's always going to be somebody who's willing to do the wrong thing. The point is, in saying that, is that there are people that were coming close to them, and you can see the Hamas members say no. And this is the translation is proven. It's against our religion. You're not allowed to touch them. They're under our protection. Now, again, you could argue an individual elsewhere took action and so on. But the point is that is pretty strongly showing you the opposite of what they frame everybody there thinks, including all the children that were born today, right? Just everybody there is all Hamas. They all voted for Hamas. They all want to rape and pillage. It's bigoted. It's racist, even if there is some element of that, which again, you'll find literally anywhere. Take a look at Israeli society. You'll find a lot of it. Same with the United States. But it says the IDF Southern Command and Gaza Division also wrote in the document, according to Khan, that they expected Hamas to take between 200 and 250 hostages. The officials even had intel on how Hamas intended to treat the hostages in certain extreme circumstances and what rules Hamas set for executing hostages. Now, again, this is coming from what they claim they saw. So you also have to ask how much has been embellished, which is pretty much what all corporate media does, right? Wonder if this is about, I've never argued for 1 second that they were not capable of all of the things they're claiming of. And this is obviously one of the reasons, because you can see the very clear funding coming from Mossad and the other elements that have driven these kind of terroristic activities through Zionism all around the world. But my point is that I wonder whether this is actually what it says. Israel mistakenly believed, the Times of Israel reported, that Hamas would never be able to get past its high-tech border security. I mean, I always highlight Efrat Fangenson's work on this, from Israeli Jew herself, who's been screaming about this, former IDF, the first week she was calling this out. There's no way this was an accident. No way. The amount of evidence and information she put forward about the border fences, and you'll see some of this in these clips and documentaries, especially the last one, that it's just impossible. There's just no way. In my opinion, there's absolutely no way this was a whoopsie. We just never thought they'd be able to, walk right through, as we saw in many of these videos. So to me, that's a huge red flag that shows you this is about coordinating our vision of looking back as they're failing in all of this. A controlled leak. And it says that an iron wall composed of concrete tunnels and razor wire, complete with remote controlled machine guns, that was installed 2 years before the attack. They just made it through. I mean, it's a really hard thing to swallow. That oversight prevented top Israeli intelligence leaders from doing anything about the internal report detailing their plans. At least that's what they're reporting from Israeli media. Does that, I mean, I don't even know how, other than just stating it like that, asking for any more details makes that near impossible to flesh out. How exactly do we, doing nothing, whatever. I argue because there's an element of this that wanted this to happen. But the idea that you could argue that everything we've seen on foot, I mean, even go with no matter what they showed them to have, none of that would be able to circumvent the machine gun, barbed wired, concrete walls, and everything they used. There's endless amounts of evidence showing them coming through to nothing. There's nobody there. It's just not possible, in my opinion. It says, and it wasn't just a few weeks before October 7th. Israel reportedly that they knew about these plans. More than a year before the attack, again, what you've heard on this show, Israel had a 40-page document detailing play-by-play exactly how Hamas would attack the southern border. The New York Times reported last year, but Israel never took Hamas's plans seriously, which I don't believe, assuming the militant group would never get past Israel's defenses. Now, the one argument people make that you could at least argue is, like possible, is that they just were so full. I mean, look at their propaganda today. The Israeli Zionist government is drowning in their idiocy. It's embarrassing. Even the people that support them, it's really, I don't even need to make it any more clear. It's embarrassing how badly they're lying about very serious things. So maybe you question, like, how did they ever, were they always this bad? I mean, how does that even make sense? So there's been an element that has just been bolstering that and allowing people to not look at it and so on. So you could argue that maybe they were just so full of hubris that they just thought just never, and they were wrong. I mean, look at their military capacity right now. Their capabilities are pretty subpar, and that's being pretty nice. And that's whether Lebanon or anything else. And that's not my personal opinion. I'm not a military expert. I've spoken to Israeli military, people all over the world who very clearly would make it's laughable to suggest that they could do any of this. Well, if the U.S. and everybody else weren't supporting them, this would be over a long time ago. But the point is that they would just let this. I guess before I go past it, the point is that ultimately you could argue that they had just a higher opinion of their own capacity, right? And but it was unfounded because of the way the world has bolstered them, and the U.S. government has hidden their crime. So maybe I'm just saying that to be objective. I genuinely think that's a really hard sell. Hamas militants attacked southern Israel on October 7th, killing 1,200 people. It's odd that they keep saying that. Even the 1,200 number within the first month was pulled back at least to 1,100 something, according to the people that, based on the idea that there were Hamas members that they mischaracterized as Israelis, which then very clearly at that time showed you that they were just killing everybody and they mixed them up because they burned them all alive in those homes. That's the Yasmin Porat aspect. But the point is that they admitted that. And yet still the Western media just continue because it's a bullet point. 1,200. That's what we're supposed to say, right? Israeli entities have proven that not to be true. And even then, I argue it's a very debatable number in general. But it says many whom are still being held in captivity. The exact number of hostages Hamas took is unclear, many of which are military targets. And there's going to be an argument today about how majority of them are military targets, which I agree with. But Israel has estimated it was around 240, with about 116 still in Gaza. Wait, I think 70 plus they've killed themselves. Israel's subsequent airstrikes and war against Hamas in Gaza have killed more than 37,000 Palestinians, many of whom are women and children. Most, is what it should say, are women and children, according to Palestinian health authorities, which Israel's own military and intelligence have acknowledged are both reliable and accurate, both quotes, as well as just about anybody else has been acknowledging this stuff going back as long as you can look. So you could argue, of course, they could lie today. So could Israel. But the background shows that they're accurate, and Israel has made a case, and through this, the intelligence element, that they're using the Gaza Health Ministry numbers in their own reports. And yet you still get the little Mikey Rappaports of the world out there acting like you're so stupid for believing Hamas. Do you mean the Hamas that Israel funds? Right, and round we go. They never want to address the facts. They just like their bullet points. So this is interesting because it's not new. How is it possible we can have this conversation right now in the midst of all of this, and the very people that are still funding these entities that don't even acknowledge this information? Now, here's the thing that stood out to me as a really interesting point. So the report they claim they got, September 19th. So this we're going to go over more tomorrow. This is another kind of overview breakdown of a lot of their data points of aid and kind of back and forth through the crossings. Take a look at fuel and cooking gas. But of course, which they argue and certainly could be used for munitions or bombs, I guess. But right about October, September. Now it looks August, September. Around about August on all of them, the numbers are still pretty much in line with what you've seen the years before. That's what these two lines are. The red line, it was, let's see. Oh, it's right here. The red line is 2023. The darker, maroon line is 2022. Okay. So October 2023 is October 7th. Okay. So it's August to September. My point being, in September is where the deviation begins. You see a dramatic drop. from September forward on each one of these, petrol, cooking gas. Now explain for me if October 7th was when this happened, which is meaning that's when they said no more, no fuel, no water, which is all a crime. Yet the month before that they already had dramatically decreased. And so too at the aid, by the way, I've shown you this. The aid had diminished as well. So what did they know? Clearly something. I find it almost impossible this would perfectly coordinate to remove the things that might be necessary for survival after, because the whole point, remember, would be if you believe this was allowed, one, to, as I would argue, to, from Zionist perspective, justify your existence, but also use it as a justification to do what you've always been trying to do, which is take the rest, remove the Palestinians and take all of what you argue is yours. And what better way to do that than to starve them and remove what they need to survive? Pretty interesting. Now, of course, there could be another explanation. There's always objectivity, but I find that pretty striking. Now, this is a really good breakdown, by the way. We'll go over this more tomorrow of the crossings and just, showing you, I'll show you a really quick point, actually, since this is so interesting to me. 2024. Look at, now what this is showing you is entries through the crossings, all of them, and exits, meaning that there's the exits they count as people leaving, but they enter into the security zone and they don't always make it in, which is the entry, right? So check it out. When you have 50,000 exits and 3,000 entries, how does that work out? I don't even need to explain it. It's because they're letting all these trucks in, and then 99% of them are being turned around after 9 hours in a queue and told to go back. That's what that looks like right there. So just the evolution of the ongoing starvation that they pretend isn't happening as they lie about it over and over and over. We'll go over this more in the next show tomorrow. Now, remember, the fuel and everything else declining the month before. Very important. Now, this came out yesterday, and everyone's just highlighting, and there's an English dub in here if you want to just listen to what she said in English, but it was in a Hebrew reporting. It's all the stuff that we just went over. You know this. And it's basically just telling us that this, that they had an end-to-end they had all the training information. They all knew ahead of time. Simply highlights. Imagine my shock. But I guess not everyone has been taught to question everything, and will find this shocking. And Casey Wright highlights, Israel has a military censor, which is a good point, which means this release is part of an attempt to remove him from power, I guess Netanyahu. You could argue that's one of the possibilities, but just the first part's important. Think about this. If we've seen Haaretz, which I should have brought this up, actually, the actual article, I forget the title, but if we've seen Haaretz, which came out last month, publish an article that was, it felt like it was a parody, but it wasn't, that literally had black bars censoring content. Oops. Hold on. Is this right here? Something started playing. Thank you, Twitter. Let me mute the tab real quick. Okay. So what I was saying is Haaretz clearly has, or not Haaretz, but the Israeli military or just the government censors content. That it's so is the United States government, but I'm talking like, imagine you saw the New York Times with an article and they're in the paragraph, part of it was blacked out with black bars per the U.S. government. You would blow your mind. Even though we know they censor, it's just like right on the surface. And we're supposed to call that press freedom. How embarrassing we pretend that's not exactly what it is. And yet they're like Iran and Russia and China, which all are their own issues. But that's crazy. My point is they are censoring and filtering all of this, and this comes through. So just recognize that. Anything coming through these platforms to some degree, I would argue, is to one degree or another being allowed. It's not always because they have complete control over everything. I argue there's a balance even with their censorship, but ultimately if they really wanted to, they could stop it. So think about that. And here's Ana M. Fuentes, who says, yes, this is just this person's highlighting this, saying, breaking IDF document distributed only 2 weeks before October 7th accurately describes their plan to invade down to the number of civilians. Huge scoop from, this is the person from Con News. But it's not, though. Isn't this always how it works? We know this well. A la Azov movement and all those other ridiculous people in the two-party illusion that screamed that they were breaking news and removing Israel from the story. Recommend you check out our work about the Azov movement, Israel, and the Ukraine to understand the bigger picture, the framing of it all, the operation or aerodynamic. The point is, this is corporate media going breaking and giving you just the way to right in the right framing. I argue it's a controlled demolition. She simply highlights, Ana Fuentes says, yeah, but this is not a scoop. It's a well-orchestrated leak. The IDF document already planned by Hamas is a 100-plus page long CIA Mossad blueprint, that's her argument, for their October 7th Black Op PSYOP called Operation Jericho Wall. They went over this back on October 10th. And she's right. Let's talk about that. This is interesting to me that this is so very surface, like very, very right on the surface. This is Jerusalem Post, in fact, covering the New York Times, which is entitled, Israel Knew Hamas's Attack Plan More Than a Year Ago. Isn't this strange? So it's not really breaking news when you literally was told to you back in November 30th from New York Times, of all places. But yet this guy's being told he's breaking the story. It's interesting. And that's how the Israeli media is framing it. So it could just be a release just for Israeli media that we're talking about. This is what Jerusalem Post said. Israel had detailed Hamas attack plans a year ago, dismissed them. It says the bombshell report by the New York Times claims that Israeli officials had a detailed approximate 40-page document outlining point by point the plans for Hamas attack on Israeli soil, but dismissed the plan as aspirational and beyond the group's capacities. But if you look at the actual actions, none of it was about beyond their capacities. In fact, it would have been had they not been able to just, meander through the open holes in the wall and whatever else wasn't there to stop them. And the machine guns on, motion censored turrets just didn't work for some reason, all that stuff. The document, which authorities codenamed Jericho Wall, is what Anna was referencing, reported to have outlined a methodical assault on which drones would attack Israel's surveillance system, which I don't believe actually happened the way that they're framing it. Some kind of systematic attack on exactly the right location. That's not what we're seeing. And people like Efrat Fengenson have made arguments that are very convincing based on the evidence you can prove that show you that's not even remotely what happened. I'll leave it there for now. The most of it's redundant, and some of this will be in general. But it says the approximately 40-page document right here, which the Israeli authorities codenamed Jericho Wall. Just showing you this in the New York Times Post. Now, Ryan Grimm highlights an interesting point. They had this document in hand, right, before, and still approved the Nova Festival for an extra night and moved it, that he doesn't add, which they did, right up close to the area that they apparently were planning to break through. I mean, okay, so this gets into the overlap of both, right? Not just the foreknowledge, but the Hannibal directive. I mean, I would maybe even something entirely and disgustingly different. Sacrificing these people, right? So it's like a preemptive Hannibal directive, if you want to look at it that way. And we're going to show you in one of these videos. I mean, there's just no way to deny it. We've seen some of this already, but IDF members using civilian cars while their civilians hiding and fleeing or hiding within them filming, and they're using their cars to hide behind while shooting at the other people. That's a human shield, ladies and gentlemen, whether it's intentional or not. But the idea that they would do that, I would argue that's a Zionist concept. This goes back to origins of Zionism and the justification. Or, I mean, how about this? Back to its actual pre-Israel illegal state conversation, that this CIA document highlights that Zionists were willing to sacrifice the Jews in Arab nations for their agenda. It's exactly what it says. This is from the CIA. See if I can grab it real quick. Oh, dang it. That's why. Okay, what is going on? I'm sorry for the delay. My computer doesn't want to work with me right now. Like everything else electronic in my life. Here we go. Oh, that's the wrong one. So that just showing you that this is the CIA document highlighting that they knew at the time that the Jewish agency is apparently willing to sacrifice Jews in these Arab countries, right? I mean, it's very interesting. And all it shows you is that, was it not really about the Jewish people, or was it about their agenda, willing to sacrifice them for what they wanted as the Zionist organization, which is obviously what we've been highlighting for a long time. So I find that very interesting, the overlap there, right? And the point being that if they were allowing that and even moved it closer to the area, it's kind of hard not to see that they might have been willing to put it out as bait, knowing that they were going to allow this, knowing that they would do something, or at least I think thinking that they would. And then the argument becomes that they didn't. And this becomes interesting when you find out after the fact that they didn't know there was that happening there. That was revealed by Israeli media, that Hamas didn't even know that there was a festival there. And I argue they came through and argue, and there was people within that did take, which you can see, but then it was the IDF in crossfire that killed many of them, which was admitted by Israeli people and security heads that were there. So that becomes a sacrifice to justify that they're the bad guys and you need to exist because they hate the Jews. And that's the game that's played. Now, just in case you're uncertain about the reality of this, Even Times of Israel wrote about this back in 2016, but sort of like the human shield neighbor procedure dynamic, they said we're done with that, and they've continued to use it ever since. This is Times of Israel reporting, Israeli army cancels controversial Hannibal protocol. So just digest that and recognize that. Let's just even say they did cancel it, and they meant it. From before 2016, they had a protocol that allowed them to kill their own people if they were going to be taken. That's what this means. And so it's real, and they did it, and they've had it. And I argue it never went away, which is very easy to prove. So just make sure we understand this is not some hypothetical conspiracy theory concept. And we've talked about this in overlaps. This one was from January 11, 2024. The International Court of Justice, or rather the IDF insiders, admit Hannibal Directive. Hostages weren't our top priority. And we've talked about this. They've said this many, many times. This is an IDF insider that just simply admits that they're deliberately bombing civilians. I believe that was the 972 magazine article. We also just have the other of many now IDF whistleblowers who are admitting that, yeah, they're killing people and they're going to live with it forever.
Do you think that you witnessed war crimes taking place?
Probably. The ground assumption is that they are Hamas. And then if you go this way, you're bound to kill people that are not.
Now, in a rare interview, one soldier tells us about the reality he says he witnessed. What kind of stuff would they say?
There are no uninvolved, only unarmed. This is something that I'm going to carry for the rest of my life.
Here is a post from Max Blumenthal in regard to highlighting a Ynet News article, which one of the craziest parts about just this first aspect is that it's all over the Israeli media, which the Israeli people are aware of this, guys. That's why people like Efrat Fengenson and others on the ground have been screaming about this, as well as wanting their families back because they realize there's more going on. And all you get is Netanyahu screaming that he's fighting for them and that you're racist if you don't fight for him, and that Biden says the same thing and Blinken lies about it. And it's a one round and round dynamic. Of course, the Western media toes all those lines for you. Meanwhile, the people everywhere see what's going on. This is what it's like to live under an authoritarian rule. But he says the Ynet investigation on October 7th confirms mass Hannibal, friendly fire orders, 70 cars hit by the helicopters. Now, that's the image we're talking about here. The idea that these cars, one of the main aspects of this is that they bombed these cars knowing that they were civilians. And you'll see some of these in the clips. And then, of course, and the image I used for the main show today, which, of course, I took off of a live video because everyone's coming after me for copyright right now, even though I'm acting under fair use or acting in good faith to look for Creative Commons. The image that on the show today is actually of the street before they cleared it. And some of them are just cars that are just, kind of dented and turned and they jumped out. But many of them are looking just like this. Now, there's a reason they scooped them all out of the side and jammed them up against the wall. And that's what they then showed. And all the corporate media dutifully only showed that image because it's clear that they were bombing them as they were fleeing, which means that they knew they likely had people in them. They ordered that. It's impossible to miss that very clear aspect. And that's why Ynet News said, yes, they did order a mass Hannibal. 70 cars were hit by Israeli helicopters, tanks, or anti-tank missiles, which is responsible for some of the burned bodies in these cars. Hamas did not have the capability to do that. And the house example with the tanks, that was Yasmin Porat, which we'll show you. Well, she said she watched them. She told them there's people in there. And then they were ordered to bomb it, and they did. And they burned them all. Some of which were Hamas members, some of which were civilians, including children. And they knew that. And Hamas members were then counted as Israelis. That's why the number was false. I mean, it's ridiculous and obvious. Firing regulations abandoned. And you can read this full report for yourself. Here's the Credo highlighting a colonel. This is my point about how clear this has been, whether it's a brigadier general admitting that they can't even win this war and they know that, or, all these different aspects where it's people internally, high level, telling you this is what you're being told, not what the corporate media is saying, not what Netanyahu is saying. This colonel Erez says what we saw here was a mass Hannibal. It's in Hebrew. You can listen to it. He just says there were many openings in the fence, thousands of people in many different vehicles, both with hostages, both with, and without, and they opened fire on all of them. He says it was an impossible mission to identify and do what the pilots did, which is bomb all the cars you can see in the background. Here's a video from the cradle. During a TV show on Hebrew Channel 13, Israeli Army Commander Bar Zonshin admits to implementing the Hannibal Directive. Also in Hebrew. He says, we identified 2 pickup trucks on the move, Toyotas. It says there's a number of people on them. A lot who are standing inside the cabin. He says, and a pile of people. A pile of people in the back, dead bodies. He says, I don't know. Or living people, we don't know. Right. And I decided to attack these vehicles. So right there. I find it hard to believe he decided, but even if he did, that's even worse. The point is they bombed these places not even knowing whether or not these cars, whether or not those were their own people. You must know that. He must know that. It says, so you suspect this was a kidnapping? He says, yes. So right there, he says, yes. So you suspected it was a kidnapping and you bombed the car. Yes. Okay. There's just no way to misunderstand that. He says, you get the order from him to shoot. He said, yes. And we shot. Now, for the video, this is a new person for the podcast, but we're both acknowledging the same thing. And he goes, and we shoot. He says, and this back to the other guy, and we shoot at the car. And he says, and we shoot at the second car. The first car, I think we hit. There was a flash. The target is already very far away, about 2,000 meters. And the second car, I think we missed. Did you manage to hit the cars? The other guy. We couldn't confirm. He said it was a very short. It says, really, we saw the cars only for a millisecond. There's no way to tell. And why do you decide to attack the pickup trucks? The other guys asked. Because my gut feeling told me that they, soldiers from another tank, could be on them. So you might be killing them with that action. They are your soldiers. He says, right. That's pretty blithe, right? He says, but I decide this is the right decision. So you make a conscious decision, and unilaterally, apparently, which again, kind of don't believe, to murder potentially not only your own military members, but civilians because they're fleeing back to Gaza? Like, just think about this in any other context. Your family member's being kidnapped, and the police run up and bomb the car and say, hey, we didn't want him to get taken. Okay, well, is that what we all want? I mean, there's nobody in the world that thinks that's the right move. This is sinister, in my opinion. He goes on to say, but it's better to stop the kidnapping. Just in case you were, this is about as clear as it gets. And they won't be taken. And in hindsight, he says, do you think you did the right thing? He says, in hindsight, I feel like I did the right thing. It was a decision. I mean, how do their families feel about that? They don't know, right? Because if they haven't seen this, they're being told lies from the military cabinet, from the Israeli government, from the Western media, from Biden, from Lincoln. They're all lying about it. How dare you suggest that? Blood libel. But here he is going, yeah, it was the right thing. Kill him just in case. Pretty hard to miss that. And I argue some people even here haven't seen this stuff. I think that's the point. You get it. And it goes on, the same thing. He asked them the same point. I know that for a moment we did the best we could. Yes. Is this the order, or is it in your head? He says, what? No, I'll watch that. It does. He mentions the Hannibal Directive. He says, is this the order, or is it in your head? What is called the Hannibal order. The order itself. He says, there are a few gradual things you have to do. You need to fire and blockage points and control points. And in case of positive identification, you have to execute the order. Does it weigh on you today? Today, I know that we didn't hurt them. I don't even know what that means, because of certain things, he says, that I'd rather keep to myself for now. That is pretty weird. So just to theorize here. So what is he suggesting right there? so maybe you didn't kill hostages because you somehow know that they weren't there. I mean, that seems to be somewhat the implication. I don't believe that. I think it's clear that they were killed. But was he told something else? Was he told by somebody ahead of him, above him, that no, it's a plan and it's only Hamas members and we're tricking them? I mean, who knows? Whatever got them to think he was doing the right thing, or maybe he just doesn't care about killing his own people. He says, but it doesn't weigh on me because, long pause, that image of people being taken by those murderers, right? And this is what drives it, right? The idea that you just know they're just savages, even though that's not the case. Whatever your thoughts about Hamas, this game they play where it's just the dehumanization, right? Everybody in Hezbollah, everybody in Iran, and the entire country, they're all evil savages, right? It's racism, bigotry, and just politics all, bunched together to get you to think exactly what they want you to think for them at your expense. It says, but they are holding them captive and they're being tortured, right? So this is the assumption. It hasn't even happened yet, right? Because they're being propagandized. And guess what? That's not happening according to everything we can prove. So anyway, the point is, yes, Hannibal Directive. Yes, they did this. Yes, he thinks it's the right thing for reasons I can't tell because they're safe or whatever. Very interesting. Now, here's Mondowai's article that goes just in depth about this conversation. Another Israeli soldier admits to implementing the Hannibal Directive. Here's a Gray Zone article we've gone over many times, which is well worth the read. This is, they discuss Yasmin Porat, that she confirmed in the interview with Israel radio that the military undoubtedly killed numerous Israeli non-combatants, including with gun battles. And it's not just him stating that. It's directly quoted. And you've all seen the videos themselves, which I don't think they have it linked in here. I mean, these are important as well. Every one of these points we've gone over extensively. The idea that the commander at the crossing ordered them to bomb a location where they knew their own military people were. All of this stuff's on the record, guys. The corporate media just can't piece it together, apparently. Here is Haaretz from December 13th. If Israel used a controversial procedure against the citizens, we need to talk about it now. They don't really make any, they clearly lay out that it seems to have happened and then just kind of leave it up in the air at the end of the article, but it simply highlights the same thing. This is Brigadier General Barak Harim's highlighting this. A tank positioned near the house fired 2 shells, one at the ground, one at the roof, of the 14 hostages still inside the building they just fired on. 2 of them children. Only Hadass Dagan survived. Yasmin Porat's first public account of the incident appeared 2 days later and was later verified by Dagan himself. No misunderstanding this. They murdered those children and their families because, Hannibal Directive, or because we know there's Hamas members in there. Anybody okay with that? I don't think Israelis are okay with that. Here is an article from January 17, 2024. Unlawful, unethical, horrifying. Direct quote from the IDF Ethics Code author. Look at that. Some of the Israelis and Zionists seem, or I don't, who knows if he's a Zionist, but Israelis seem to have ethics, or at least somebody who wrote the codes who seems to care about them, on alleged use of Hannibal Directive during Hamas attack. And it's just simple. It's exactly the stuff we're going over. He says it's known as the Hannibal Directive, although no one is quite sure of the reason behind the name. It's very real. It's very clear. And he's saying it was unlawful, unethical, and horrifying. Here's one of the videos we're going to play first. This is from PVT. Their 5-minute video. Now, it's really just kind of images and mute. We're going to stop and point some things out. 5-minute video proving Israel killed hundreds of settlers on October 7th. Right? So, again, pretty much everybody in these kibbutz areas, these were illegal settlers. No matter what you think about them, whether they knew it or not, they were in a location that was illegal, as illegal settlement, and they were illegal settlers by simple default, by being there, which is a crime. Now, they may think differently, but that's not an opinion. That is a static fact. Even the U.S. government calls these settlements illegal. They just don't care to stop what they're doing. The point is they killed a lot of these people. It says how Israeli forces killed hundreds of Israelis on October 7th. So bomb goes off in your door. This is showing you is sort of what it looks like if an RPG hits a car door.
So intensely that your door flies away. There's no way you're surviving.
So the point was that all the cars they're seeing were arguably bombed with things that Hamas did not have the ability to do, at least at that volume, if you argue it was something that they might have had, like a rocket launcher or something like that. But there's disputes about all that as well. But the amount of these, and the point is that it would take a bombing enough to blow the cars out the door would clearly kill everybody in the car. And these were stacked. I mean, burned completely. I mean, these are hellfire missiles, as far as I'm concerned. These were helicopters bombing these, and that was the primary aspect we proved. 1,250 cars. Drone footage shared October 9th, hiding the cars, right? So the drone up top is the picture I took, right? Then they jumped them all up against the area a month later to hide the clear evidence of what just happened. So they know. I think that's actually pretty important. Not even all of them are all, busted up. So I wonder what happened to the ones that weren't all decimated. And it shows you a shot here. Haaretz, Mako, Ynet all confirmed the occupation forces helicopters shot targets at the festival. And they did right in the beginning. It says, according to a police source, the investigation also indicates that the IDF combat helicopters that arrived to the scene and fired at terrorists there apparently also hit some festival partygoers. Or is that what it says? Participants. So you can call that an accident, right? But if that was the only thing that happened, shouldn't there still be somebody held accountable for that? Yeah, but it didn't happen. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. There's more examples of that than almost anything else. So clearly there was some kind of an order, and we've already heard it from their mouths. Colonels, IDF leaders, they're going, this was a Hannibal directive. So all you're seeing is proof of that they did kill people at the Nova Festival as well. 28 combat helicopters were deployed. 28. Israeli pilots confessed the use of missiles on cars and admitted to shooting blind targets. We just showed you this.
כפי שהכוחות ותושבי הקיבוץ ראו אותה בזמן אמת. בשעה 4:20 אחר הצהריים, יותר מ9 שעות
The media shows Israeli tanks firing shells at kibbutz. We also have those couple of girl IDF members that said that they were ordered to and fired on civilians.
מאות מחבלים. שכונות שלמות בקיבוץ עולות באש.
אני צופה עכשיו על בארי על החלק הצפוני, אני רואה מוקד עשן בחלק הצפוני מערבי מול הבית עלמין, שם זה הקרקלים הצופים?
חיובי. התיעוד הזה חושף בפנינו את היקף הלחימה ומספר המחבלים הבלתי נתפס שהשתלטו על
הקיבוץ. It's just showing you the tanks pulling up and then firing on civilian homes. Now one of these were the ones that Yasmin Porat was discussing, which killed children. It says commanders in the field made difficult decisions. This is Haaretz, including shelling houses on their occupants in order to eliminate the terrorists without knowing whether the Israelis in those buildings were alive or dead. The IDF completed the takeover of the kibbutz. The cost of the Hamas attack was terrible. At least 112 Bari residents were killed. That's kibbutz Bari, I think. Others were kidnapped. Right. So how many of those 112 were killed by their bombing on the places which they were in? According to Israeli media, all Hamas, without question. If you say anything others, you're racist. But they admit this right in the beginning. Everything about this whole thing has been suspicious and dishonest right from the beginning. That doesn't mean everything's a lie. Certainly, we should ask that, though. It says, the occupation forces also shot many Israelis to death, thinking they were Hamas. Thinking they were Hamas. This is an example of 3 below. Dang it. Yeah, and these are just more Haaretz articles and so on. It says the IDF accidentally shot to death a resident of Nahal Oz. His family requests that he be recognized as a spaceman. I'm not sure what that means. Adi was suspected of being a terrorist and was shot dead. They demand explanations. Why did they shoot the wheels? Right? These are all Haaretz articles. Niv was mistakenly identified as a terrorist and was killed by the fire of our forces. Now, I don't think that one's Haaretz. It looks like Ynet. But these are all, we've gone over almost all of these. Now, of course, at the time, it was, it's the fog of war. They didn't know, and they accidentally shot. But when you piece all of this together, it's near impossible not to see that this, and again, now that we have them admitting were ordered to do this, it's kind of hard not to see that they were killing their own people by design. Now it says the forces used Israelis as human shields. Now, this is one of the most powerful things that I've seen in this video. So what you're going to see is this guy is in his own car at the festival, the Nova Festival, and he is hiding, filming, and you can see the IDF member right there in the video shooting using his car as a shield, knowing that there are civilians in there. That's not what police or military, that's not what we pretend they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be the ones standing between you and the bullets, not the other way around. And we've already seen this, by the way, the videos of even Shiny Luke and them ducking down by the cars. And you can see that there are both police and IDF members that were basically hiding around them and shooting. Now, the argument was that they were protecting them, but clearly that's not what happened, right? At least Shiny Luke in particular she got taken or got, I think what the evidence seems to show to me is that she was shot in the crossfire. They took her to the hospital, which was verified by Newsweek, despite all the narratives. Then that hospital got bombed. I proved this on my show within the week after she was there. I can't prove that's what happened to her that from there forward, but I can prove the timeline. The Newsweek and the mom admitted they were taken to the hospital and that she was alive at that time. Then a week later, the hospital that she was supposed to be in, unconscious, was bombed and destroyed. It's kind of hard to see that's likely more than anything else. My point, though, is that like them, these IDF members were clearly using them as cover. He's right there. See him? That's the best shot right there. Right there. He's clearly hiding behind this car when there are two people in there. You know how easy that would be, even if by accident, for them to shoot at him and hit those two people. Right there. I mean, leaning on their car for crying out loud. Now here's Yasmin Porat. Tells media Israeli forces killed everyone, including the hostages. Her podcast, this is her describing it. She said she heard the children screaming. This is a different woman. Help, please, help the children. This is the children begging, please help. Right, and then they killed them. And then barrage after barrage after barrage. That's what she just said. I mean, I think it's powerful in a terrible way. What do you think she thinks about that? How do you sit there and watch them? The children are pleading, save us, and they murder everybody in the building. Now, I'm not, who knows whether the IDF member was okay with that, but they were ordered to, and they did it. That's the Hannibal Directive, because they were possible hostages. But to me, that's not even. First of all, the Hannibal Directive is not appropriate, in my opinion, justifiable in any possible way. But within their logic, that's a terrible example because you could have at least tried to save them first and then bomb them as they fled away. But no, this is so the disregard for their own people's lives is so disgustingly obvious. And now we're to pretend that everything they're doing is for the interest of their own people, for their own hostages, as they keep killing them, which we'll get into next. Hardly. October 7th. Oh, this just goes on to talk about another example. They shot 2 missiles toward the house. Barrage after barrage after barrage. It says, and Adi tried to raise his head and say, take it down. Oh, she pushed his head down. Suddenly he tells her, saying that Ziev is no longer with us. She's describing what she saw. The tank fired 2 shells, one that hit the floor, the other to the roof. Suddenly, a horrific boom. I can't move my legs. Arm drops. I cannot move her. And do you think they wanted her to come out and say this? Do you think they wanted her to be able to come out and tell this story? I think that's quite clear. Surprised she survived.
ובשלב הזה אני אומרת לו עוד פעם שאני אוהבת אותו. היה לי ברור שיש פה טנק.
She said she loved him one more time and it was clear that the tank was there. It was absolutely clear to her, she says.
לגמרי.
Don't ask me how, I don't know.
אני לא יודעת. ואז היה הבום השני.
And then came the second boom. And you know, they've shown you all these pictures. The shot up walls, all Hamas, just chaos and shooting everything everywhere. And all you ever see is this discussion. Now, look, there's clear examples of Hamas firing, again, kidnapping Biba's family, which, again, were also killed by IDF bombing, according to their father. But over all of that, the majority of this seems to be clearly slanted in one direction, based on the evidence in front of us. That's all we can base it on.
אני מרגישה שנפגעתי.
They felt a lot of blood flowing on her from her own family members. I had to see what exactly happened to me. And then she see the side of a hole in Adi's main artery. And I take my thumb and try to block the blood flow. What else could I do? Right, and they died. And so the point is, all of this gets framed as Hamas did everything. She knows better. So does Yasmin. They've been telling everybody that, well, listen. And then they get attacked as anti-Semitic or somehow against Israel by telling their story about Israeli military murdered their families for their own. I mean, it's so overwhelming. It's endless. That doesn't have to mean everything else. But that story is alone is clear, and they've lied about it to this very moment. Here's another clip. This one's later. This was March 4th. Cuds News Network put this out. Remember, and I'll just conclude this. You can watch it. It's all in Hebrew. And this is just another one of these hostages who's admitting that it says Israeli media published a leaked audio of 2 Israeli hostages. Now, this is after October 7th, guys, yelling for the IDF to save them, but the IDF killed them instead. There's more. I mean, this is, again, we've only seen, 7 hostages taken back? So many of them detainees and POWs. Over 70 plus have been killed by them, many of which we can prove, like this. This is just like those holding the SOS sign, which I'll show you in a minute. Actually, I actually should have put this over there. I'll come back to this. And Uncaptured News, Dan Cohen, done amazing work on this from the beginning. Pretty sure I'm following this. I was. Uncaptured News, you should follow. Exclusive, October 7th survivor testimony contradicts Israeli military's justification for killing civilians. Yasmin Porat tells Dan Cohen that her Hamas captor did not possess advanced weaponry, contrary to claims by Israeli Brigadier General Barak Harim, meaning they did not have what they claimed they even had. It was even, like, the point was what they claimed they had still wasn't capable of what we've seen. But the reality turns out they didn't even have that. They've been lying about damn near everything here, guys. And I think this goes back to the earlier point that there was some level of allowance. Oh, actually, I didn't even end up going into that. But the only point I was going to add about the foreknowledge is just simply that I think it's important to think about. I mean, actually, I think there's going to be an opening to talk about it when we get into the documentary. But, you know, it's likely that this was allowed to happen completely. For many different reasons that we could discuss. But I find it far more likely that there were elements of the more radical, without any foresight type of elements, like the Jewish Power Party, the religious Zionism group, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and that whole angle of it. They're lunatics. They're all pretty wild, crazy. My point, this group is just something special. I argue they would not think twice about allowing something like this. Just like in the beginning, sacrifice the Jews, the Arab countries for their benefit, sacrifice these people for X, Y, and Z, that they would do this to justify their existence, which is clearly being called out. Not Jews or Israel, but the Zionist organization more than anything before October 7th. It's only gotten worse now. And so the argument could be that and this is what makes most sense to me, there was an element of this that allowed this to happen. And some elements of it didn't know or didn't want that, or, who knows? And that's why the reaction wasn't exactly what you'd expect. Or it was so weirdly disjointed and there were so many miscommunications. And that's what it sounds like to me. But this is just my opinion based on all the things we can see. What we know for sure is that they were told repeatedly by their own people, by Egypt, telling them, we see this coming. We've seen the planning. We've got the internal documents, their own people on the walls. We see them training. We see them doing this. They're coming out and they're, over and over, threatening them if they keep talking about it. I just don't know how we don't see that for exactly what it is. And another uncaptured news, Israel's intentionally killing the captives in Gaza. Israeli airstrike kills more and more captives. Top experts say Israel has implemented the Hannibal Directive. So my point is this goes beyond immediacy, where they're being taken, which is technically what it's really supposed to be. Now we're talking about being held in Gaza and just seemingly being a target going forward because you're a captive, which just does not make any moral sense from the perspective that they're trying to save them. Electronic Intifada highlights an important video we're going to play next. New evidence emerges of Israel killing its own civilians. And this overlaps into Gaza, and we'll show this. This is the video right here, but I'll read these real quick. 3 killings were due to a combination of panicked, indiscriminate fire and application of the Hannibal Doctrine, an Israeli military procedure that allows its forces to prevent the captive Israelis by any means, even if that means killing them. And it says almost all of the information about so-called friendly fire incidents on October 7th comes from Israeli sources and media. And yet this is rarely reported in Western outlets. Because you know why? Because they're not journalists, guys, which continue to stick closely to Israel's official propaganda narrative. Now, that has changed. I argue because of opportunism. I argue because they're people with eyes and they can recognize that this has been a lost effort. So they could go down with the ship or they could try to gain back your, trust, which you should not be giving to corporate media. I think that's largely what's happening. But the point is the same. They're still not even going over this kind of stuff. It says, but even the Israeli media with the information has trickled out slowly. Seemingly each week, a new piece of evidence comes out. Indeed, on Thursday, Haaretz revealed yet another such incident. And this is the one we've already talked about as well. This one is from February 2024. Israeli Nova party goer was misidentified as Hamas terrorist. That's the third one discussed today. There's a lot of these. On October 7th, killed by Israeli forces, misidentified as a Hamas terrorist? How exactly were you identifying who was and who wasn't as people were screaming and running with their hair on fire? How's that work? This is just a narrative, guys. They were killing everybody in front of them. Now, again, to be clear, I don't think every IDF member and everybody there was even okay with that concept, which we've now seen clearly as people have spoken out. There's whistleblowers. So just because they were given that order, which I'm not sure is exactly was a ubiquitous concept or not, the point is that not everybody was, because of the IDF, they were not just getting shot by everybody there. But I made this point from the early on discussion about the location of the festival and where they had a block, according to these documentaries, set up in the front of one of his kibbutz. And the point was these people ran from the festival right into that block. And a lot of them got shot right like this. And so that doesn't really add up to me. It seems like a coordinated kind of choke point, quite frankly. But either way, there's no denying this. So let's watch this clip. This is their 12 minutes. This is from GDF, how Israel murked its own civilians on October 7th. Hey, look at that. Instagram censored our show.
I know everyone's a little curious about the subject. Did the Israeli military kill its own citizens on October 7th and the days afterward? Can all of the 1,200 deaths be laid at Hamas's door? Well, most people appear to be reluctant to look into it. After all, looking into friendly fire incidents on October 7th can make people targets for slander and misrepresentation. They can easily be described as conspiracy theorists and the like. One of the very few, if not the only outlet that has continuously covered the topic is the Electronic Intifada. By merely updating its readership on the known facts of friendly fire incidents over the course of October 7th and afterward, they have been targeted with at least one attack article from the Washington Post, where they were lumped in with right-wing Holocaust deniers, saying they exaggerated claims. Obviously, the electronic intifada weren't fazed by it and continued reporting. So, relying off of their work and the work of others as well, I've created a little bit of a timeline of the reports of friendly fire incidents on October 7th and afterward in order to lay out simply what we know so far. This is inconclusive, and I've already waited for some time to make a video on it since I wanted some time to pass for more information to be known. We don't know how many of the 1,200 deaths can be attributed to Israel or Hamas, but we can't attribute all of them to Hamas. Indeed, the Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis line, which has been a key justification for the ongoing genocide and deliberately induced famine in Gaza, can be shown to be demonstrably false. Let's get started. One of the first reports of friendly fire on October 7th came just days later, on October 15th, in the Israeli Yediot Aharonot. Excerpts from the article, written by Yoav Zaytun, went viral on Twitter, including the following. After the pilots realized that it was very difficult to distinguish between terrorists and Israeli soldiers or civilians, the decision was made that the first objective of the fighter helicopters is to stop the deluge of terrorists. 28 fighter helicopters shot over the course of the day all of the ammunition in their bellies. We're talking about hundreds of 30mm cannon mortars and Hellfire missiles. The frequency of fire at the thousands of terrorists was enormous at the start, and only at a certain point did the pilots begin to slow their attacks and carefully choose the targets. According to the Air Force, in the first 4 hours of the start of the battles, helicopters and fighter craft attacked about 300 targets, most in Israeli territory. As early as October 20th, Nir Hassan writes for Haaretz about an incident at the kibbutz Be'eri. Hassan spoke with a resident named Tuval Eskapim, and according to him, only on Monday night, and only after the commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses with all their occupants inside in order to eliminate the terrorists along with the hostages, did the IDF complete the takeover of the kibbutz. The price was terrible. At least 112 Be'eri people were killed. Others were kidnapped.
It's interesting how it sort of rings, like a lot of this propaganda has, because I think Israel really thought they could just do the same, like, you know, asking Madeline, Madeline McCain, I always forget her name all of a sudden. Madeline Albright. I think that's right. Saying, you know, asking for 60 minutes, is it worth it? 500,000 children have been killed. Is it worth it? Yeah, we think it's worth it. It's amazing that that kind of thing could fly at any point in anywhere in history, but it did, and crazily enough. And so you could argue that this was sort of the, you know, these forlorn hero, you know, because the idea that they're so inherently good and everyone knows they're good, which isn't true, neither of them, but that's the framing that so we had to, because it was just, we had, you know, it was worth it. We had to do it, but it didn't work. Right. I think it's indicative of a couple of things. The completely disintegrating moral standing of both of these entities over a long period of time. But clearly, I just thought, like, it's like, they keep doing the comparisons, like where they go, well, you know, look at what the U.S. did in Iraq. You guys weren't screaming then. It's like, well, yeah, we were, though. And you can't just keep making these what about arguments. But the thing is, their argument is so transparent. So it's okay you commit genocide because you didn't care about that genocide, like that kind of an argument. They've been really trying to lean into that to make us feel guilty, like which we should in many ways for allowing this as a society. But like Lindsey Graham arguing that Israel should be able to use nukes in Gaza because we use nukes in Japan, right, guys? Like this weird arguments like that. I think that's what that's about right there.
Yesterday, 11 days after the massacre, the bodies of a mother and her son were discovered in one of the destroyed houses. It is believed that more bodies are still lying in the rubble. Another witness, Israeli Lieutenant Colonel Salman Habaka, spoke to The Guardian's Peter Beaumont on November 2nd. I arrived in Be'eri to see Brigadier General Barak Hiram, and the first thing he asked me is to fire a shell into a house where Hamas was sheltering. The first question that comes to your mind is, are there hostages there?
Right, we did
all the preliminary checks before we decided to fire a shell into a house. And then we went from house to house to free the hostages. And that's how the fighting was until the evening, in the kibbutz and in the streets. The New York Times would go on to provide a revealing quote from the commander of Israeli forces at Kibbutz Be'eri, the aforementioned Brigadier General Barak Hiram. The Israeli commander who led the fight detailed how he had authorized tank fire to end what was already an hours-long standoff, even at the cost of civilian casualties.
So there's two things to point out. Not really one, but which way it goes. Is that so that guy at least stated that all the checks were completed and then they fired. Now, maybe he was told that. Maybe he thought that. It's not what happened, right? Or maybe he's lying because he feels guilty about killing people, that Israeli civilians. I mean, who knows? The point is, his quote is the inconsistent one. The rest of them have been clear that they fired, is at the expense of the hostage, which is kind of what you get from this propaganda from Israel, right? No, it was a Hamas missile that backfired. Oh, wait, no, it was justified because there was a Hamas tunnel. Or wait, which, whatever. Oh, either one you like, whichever one works. That's what happened early on about the Ali hospital. They came out, Hananya Naftali, and said, no, it was a Hamas. Or no, he came out early and said, it was Hamas using them as human shields, so we bombed it, which is what they've used for every hospital since. But then the IDF came out at the same time and said, no, it was a Hamas missile that backfired. So he deleted it, changed the story. And then from there forward, they used human shields. So it's always that kind of a game. So I don't know what applies there, but what we do know for sure is that civilians were killed in these buildings. So either he did bad checks or they didn't check at all, which I think is the latter.
Another survivor of the Kibbutz Be'eri incident, a Yasmin Porat, provided her testimony to radio host Aryeh Golan for his program This Morning, hosted on the state radio station Khan, which subsequently went viral.
יש 5 בני ערובה ששוכבים או 6 על האדמה בחוץ, ממש כצאן לטבח מול הירי של הימ"מ שלנו
sheep to the slaughter in the face of our shooting by our commandos.
והמחבלים.
הטרוריסטים ירו בהם?
And he asked, I remember this one is important. He asked specifically, you mean the terrorists shot them? And she says, no, they were killed by the crossfire. Understand, there was very, very heavy crossfire. So what you can very clearly understand is that means they were killed by the IDF, because you have Hamas members shooting, and feel free to argue human shield dynamic here. That this would be one of the cases where you can clearly see that they're with them, but you could argue that it wasn't by intentional design, right? That they were confronted in the house and they were just simply in there. But either way, fair enough that they have hostages in the building. And they were being shot at, right? So you could argue that. But the point becomes they were being continually shot at by the very people who knew they were there and their job it was to keep safe. And so they were not killed by a bullet flying outward from the people standing next to them. They were killed by the bullets flying in or the tank shells that were fired. So our forces shot them, and she says, undoubtedly. They eliminated everyone, including the hostages.
The Electronic Intifada attributes this ruthless response from Israeli commanders to the Hannibal Directive, a protocol that allows Israeli forces to use overwhelming force to kill one of their own captured soldiers rather than allow them to be taken prisoner.
Now, that's an important point, actually, because technically speaking, it's supposed to be only military, right? That's the argument. And then you could even argue that within the military, there might be some kind of procedural, law concept that allows them to act in that way. Like you've, signed your life over to the military, you're simply an asset to them. But when which is the reality, even if you think that or not, but in regard to the civilians who did not. Now, again, whether or not they're reservist or whatever else, because you have to realize that everyone that grows up in Israel has forced to go through the IDF, but there are people that are Israeli Americans, let's say, who grew up in the United States, who then come over from New York and steal some Palestinians' land. They didn't serve in the IDF. My point is that nonetheless, they're still, I guess the point I was making is that opens up a circumstance for a civilian who has no military overlap being killed under the actions of Hannibal Directive. I just think that makes it a little more severe.
The rationale for the Hannibal Directive is to avoid allowing an enemy to have captives that can be used in prisoner exchange negotiations. The next month, on November 16th, in an interview with Israeli diplomat and advisor Mark Regev on the Mehdi Hassan show, Regev provides a revealing admission.
We originally said in the atrocious Hamas attack on our people
On October 7th, we had the number at 1,400 casualties, and now we've revised that down to 1,200 because we understood that we had overestimated. We made a mistake. There were actually bodies that were so badly burnt, we thought they were ours. In the end, apparently, they were Hamas terrorists.
Electronic Intifada editor-in-chief Ali Abunimah observed, "It simply makes no sense that 200 bodies burned beyond recognition that Israel thought were Israeli civilians could turn out to be Hamas fighters unless Israel killed people indiscriminately."
It's very that's evident. No question. But also, first of all, think about how all these spokespeople continue to just change. None of them have shown themselves to be even very bright. I'm not trying to be mean. It's just simply reality. You watch them, they trap themselves with their own broken logic. They all seem to do it. But it's just funny how they keep shifting around. But so he made this statement. And then from there or further, it was even revised down to like 1,100 something or whatever. That's the number it ended up being, according to Israeli sources, after that revision. But so just stating my number earlier. But that's an undeniable point. And that comes to that, and realize the Yasmin Porat discussion of the one house was like, what, 14, 15 people, including children? So we're talking about 200 of just Hamas members that are intermingled with all the rest. So that is everywhere. And it's just the idea. Oh, also don't forget the idea that the dumpster full of burned bodies that I think it was Chuck Costello and plenty of others just blindly shared as a bunch of burned children, which I think Robert was one of the earliest people to highlight this. And we told you on the show long before a lot of people even knew what was going on, that those were Hamas members. And here we have it confirmed yet again down the line, because they were. And they just lied about it. 40 dead babies, 40 burnt baby, all the burned baby, all the nonsense they put out. Disgusting, horrifying propaganda to hide what they did. As actually Sam Husseini's been saying from day one, they put out a narrative about 40 bedded babies because they knew they were going to kill a lot of babies.
Just 2 days later, Haaretz published an article by Josh Briner about how Hamas didn't have prior knowledge of the Nova Music Festival. One sentence in particular reveals, apparently, the first direct official Israeli acknowledgement of Israeli friendly fire on October 7th and afterward. According to a police source, the investigation also indicates that an IDF combat helicopter that arrived to the scene and fired at terrorists there apparently also hit some festival participants. December 5th, reservist Colonel Nof Eretz is featured on the Haaretz podcast The Week.
משם הגיעו כנראה גם השמועות שהצבא הפציץ כל מיני בתים בתוך היישובים, גם נוהל קניבל, כל מיני תיאוריות קונספירציה.
The one we already went over, just talking about the Hannibal Directive, mass Hannibal, same point.
את הרכב, האם הוא יפתח באש על הרכב לפני 30 שנה, כבר על בסיס
שונים.
לא הפציצו בתים ללא אישור, גם פקודת חניבל שמדברים עליה, היא פקודה של לעצור חטיפה של רכב בודד, נכתבה על בסיס חטיפות שנעשו בלבנון כבר לפני 30 שנה, האם למסקר או לכתמם חניבל המוני, זה היה משימה בלתי אפשרית לזהות ולעשות מה שעשו.
December 12th comes another shocking admission from the Israeli army, reported in the Israeli Yediot Ahronoth. Casualties fell as a result of friendly fire on October 7th, but the IDF believes that beyond the operational investigations of the events, it would not be morally sound to investigate these incidents due to the immense and complex quantity of them that took place in the kibbutzim and southern Israeli communities due to the challenging situations the soldiers were in at the time.
Now, quickly, just to note, the green background, there was a clear game that was played with this. There's a lot of examples you can find of helicopters using that same view. So you're looking like a green kind of night vision look. And one of them, which wasn't where they were claiming, was used to argue and probably put out there, and people that share without looking, a la Twitter files, used it claiming this is proof of the helicopter shooting and so on. And they said, see, we busted them. That's not even where they said it was. The point is, this is. It's easy to show. These were put out by Israeli entities, and these helicopter shots were showing them shooting at certain areas that were, in fact, the conversation showing you the Hannibal Directive discussion. Just want to point that out because, right, what a lot of them will do is say, oh, that's that fake video you got caught for. That there's a lot of them that look that way with different locations, and there is provably videos just like that show you exactly what we're talking about. And yes, there's others that are not in the same area. The conflation of those was used to make people confused.
This policy...
And before we go past it, I want to highlight that that point is so powerful. The idea that they claim that there were so many and it just wasn't worth investigating because I argue because of the reality that it would show. But doesn't that clearly suggest that there was enough of them that would make such a difference? I mean, obviously, the evidence we've shown so far makes it undeniable that it was a huge portion of what we're talking about. The number is hard to define. But I'm of the mind that this is the majority of what happened. The evidence, I think, is pretty clear.
This policy of just simply refusing to investigate friendly fire incidents might also explain a bizarre decision by the State of Israel to bury hundreds of cars with ashes and bloodstains, as reported by the Jerusalem Post.
Right, because we're going to not take forensic evidence. We're going to not investigate everything up, left, down, and right because, we're in the middle of a war. We don't have time. But you're going to go ahead and bury all of these hundreds, thousands of cars? I forget the number. Lots of cars in the middle of all this. Take all the time to do that because you don't have time for anything else. That's literally covering up evidence. But they don't have time for anything else, including gathering evidence, but we'll bury it, though. It's evident what this is.
For the first time ever, they will bury entire vehicles. Some of the cars have bloodstains or ashes that are difficult to collect for various technical reasons that have to do with the way these individuals were killed. In order to save space and be as environmentally friendly as possible,
of course,
the cars may be shredded before being buried.
Wow.
The underlying
So think about the timing. So you don't have time to collect forensic evidence, but you can shred the cars, then bury them. Then, this is a cover-up under some flimsy the environment and all that, right? Just tap into the wedge issues, woke stuff and trans things and environment, right? We're good. Bury all the evidence.
Rationale behind this initiative is to maximize space efficiency by compacting the existing vehicles. A major expose arrived in the new year on January 12th in Yadua Haranat, written by Yov Zaiton and Ronan Bergman, who report that what happened on October 7th and afterward constituted a long series of failures, mishaps, and chaos in the Army. The article...
There's another aspect to argue, right, that I think there's no denying the Hannibal Directive part of this. But there's also the aspect of just what we've seen since. The fact that they don't seem to have much control or discipline at all in this army. And that people reacted immediately of their own accord, weren't following directions, different orders coming from different entities of different points in power. That's obviously, we've seen it the whole time. So there could be a level of that too that was just a lack of discipline.
Is worth quoting at length. The IDF decided to apply a directive similar to the Hannibal Directive, in the course of which they also shot at vehicles that may have been carrying captives. This is the question at the heart of the investigation. Where was the Israel Defense Force in the first hours of the morning of October 7th?
Right.
In those same hours, some of the hardest, most embarrassing, and infuriating chapters in the history of the Army were also written.
Now, it's varying depending on who you listen to. Efrat Fengenson seems to be the most, credible, in my opinion, on what we've seen, because she worked that location on the fences and part of the IDF and so on, intelligence. And so she claimed up, I think, 7 hours, which I find almost impossible to believe. But I do. I mean, I think she's credible in this. But I think that, let's put it this way. Impossible to believe that it was organic. There was an organized allowance that seemed to have happened in foreknowledge and all the way through. But even just an hour of absolute time when nobody's there, where they're allowed to run. They had some narrative about something going on at the other crossing where they had to go, everybody, even the fence checkpoints? That's ridiculous. Why weren't the machine guns that what she claimed would go off for a cockroach? Why weren't they activated? Right? So clearly this is something much bigger than that it was shut down, just like they shut down investigations beforehand based on knowledge that they had.
This includes a command chain that failed almost entirely and was entirely blindsided, and orders to open fire on terrorist vehicles speeding towards Gaza, even as there was a concern that they contained captives, some sort of renewed version of the Hannibal Directive. The officers of the UAV squadron, UAV as an unmanned aerial vehicle, understood that there was no point for them to wait for orders from the Air Force Command or from the Gaza Division. They did manage to get in touch with the division and essentially asked that all procedures, orders, and regulations be tossed in the trash.
Wow.
You have authority to fire at will, the Zeke operators were told by the division, Zeke as in the Elbert Hermes 450. In other words, shoot at anything that looks threatening or like an enemy.
Right, so that's, I mean, you have to say Hannibal Directive. That's, what do you think that is? Fire at everything, no matter what. I mean, or whatever looks like an enemy, but the point is to them, that's everything. They fired at everything.
The officers faced dilemmas of life and death. Where should they direct the helicopter gunships and the Zeke first? To the dozens of breaches in the fence through which the terrorists continue to arrive? To the posts currently occupied by the terrorists, where they were killing hundreds of soldiers and taking others as captives back into Gaza? Or should it be in the direction of Sderot or the kibbutzim, where the civilians were being brutalized? Eventually, the commanders sent the Apache pilots a command that has never appeared in any standing order. You have permission until further notice and throughout the entire area.
Wow.
Even all...
Now, just a quick note, you can hear them, terrorists and brutal, the things which are at least disputed in some ways around what happened on October 7th and what Hamas truly is. So you can clearly sense that there's a level of this that is at least adoptive of the Israeli perspective on some of these things, yet nonetheless is still proving that they lied about. This is what's so important about this dynamic. There's a lot of Israelis that would love to see all Palestinians gone, but nonetheless are horrified that their own military chose consciously to kill their own people. You see what I'm saying? So this is what you're finding unlikely allies in the conversation around people just acknowledging that, yes, we may be on different sides of this conversation, but we all recognize who the villain is right now. And that's even over the idea of Hamas at this point for some people that recognize that they were killed, their families were killed in such blithe fashion by their own people. It's hard to wrap your mind around that. It's a 9/11 example, right? There's Americans have gone through this before.
Almost 6.
I mean, in no way even remotely the same, right? In the amount of what we're talking about, but the dynamic of watching your government allow or even kill your own people.
6 hours after the fact, the fog covering that status evaluation was immense. This was the moment at which the IDF decided to return to a version of the Hannibal Directive. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
So I recommend never scanning any QR codes personally, but I like the group, the platform. Make sure you support them. I thought that was well done. Here is PVT highlight, just doing their own little breakdown. You take, this is their opinion, but I agree with this. Maybe not exactly the percentage, but I think that's up for debate, but I definitely agree with the direction. I think I think it was the Cradle. I think they put it somewhere over 50% were military targets. So let's again at this point recognize, before we talk about what this post is for the podcast about how many were killed on October 7th were actually military targets. Let's not forget, for those that haven't heard this, as much as it may be insulting to people that think all the propaganda makes sense, what happened on October 7th was a legal act of armed resistance. Not everything that happened that day, but the act of hitting or going through the fences as an armed entity, part of the Palestinian resistance, was an act of armed resistance protected under the Fourth Geneva Convention under international law because they're an occupied territory. They have the legal right to armed rebellion, armed resistance, whether or not they were ever attacked indefinitely as long as they're occupied. That's a fact, easy to prove. Now, what happened around that, if somebody broke through and killed, tortured, robbed, stole, raped, anything, those are all crimes. They should be held accountable for it. But it does not invalidate the reality of the armed resistance. That's the same thing I say every time. If you're going to apply that logic, then literally every war ever fought by the U.S. government should be illegal and invalidated, which maybe you can make that argument. But you can't play it one side, not the other. So we have to be able to acknowledge that and still be able to acknowledge that Hamas did, in many ways, commit crimes. The children that were taken, those were crimes, no matter how you spin that. And well as the fact that Robert has highlighted there were civilians that were shot and so on. There's crimes. No, undoubtedly, to be honest about it, right? We have to be objective. We can't pretend one thing didn't happen, because that's what Israel's doing all over the place. But my point is that at that time, anybody who was in the IDF, people that were official settlers that were given official capacity, who were armed and working for these police entities, these are technically military targets in the concept of the way that this went down. Or at least you could make arguments for settler police. Definitely military people, which are majority, are technically called military targets. Now, that does not mean they can be tortured or raped, but it means they can legally be taken as POWs, as detainees. Not children locked for 20 years because Israel doesn't like the way they look. That's very different, but that's happening, thousands of them in Israel. But understand that as much as they hate that argument, it's easy to prove, which is why they attack things like UNRWA, the right of return, and understanding the dynamics of occupation and international law, because they don't want you to know how this really works. And that, by the way, applies to the U.S. occupations, Syria, Iraq. These are they can attack U.S. forces on the ground. That would be a legally protected act of resistance, but they'll never call it that. They'll call it terrorism. That's why you frame your enemy as the boogeyman terrorist, because nothing they do is even legal under the law, because they're not real people. They're boogeyman. They're dehumanized. That's why they apply it. But so they write, if we pretend for a second Hamas killed everyone on October 7th, which we know isn't true, which they didn't because Israeli forces used the Hannibal Directive, they argue 91% of the deaths are still legitimate military targets. There's no such thing as an Israeli adult civilian. Now, that's their opinion. I would argue that there is some openings there, like I said, from people that are technically Israeli American or other places that move there, who are technically illegal settlers, but they may not be part of the IDF. So there's an argument to be made about settlers, and even the idea of human shields being these settlements surrounding these on illegal territory that Israel protects itself with. But regardless, if we're going to be as sound as we can about this, the argument would be that they would not be military targets. But then we know that post October 7th and even before, these settlers were, a lot of them, given official capacity, were given arms and protected by the IDF. So there's a fine line there. But nonetheless, the point would be that a majority of these are, even according to Cradle, are military targets. And they just give you a little graph here, October 7th death analysis. And they break it down by security forces, adult settlers, which seem to be a huge portion, right? So I'm arguing that over 50% were legal military targets, when you're not even including the settlers. But when you do, especially with the way that Israel has gone forward from this, there's an argument to be made there. But they argue 91% were military targets. You can decide for yourself. But what we know for sure is a lot of them were legal military targets. A lot of these people were killed by the IDF. And so when you add those two together, what's left? I'm not saying I know, but it's certainly not 1,200 people. And it's certainly not, they killed everybody just to kill Jews. That's not what's actually happening here. It looks like Twitter crashed on me. That's funny. Don't know how that happened. Tell you, this stuff happens a lot to me lately. Now, here is the one we showed you before. Now, this is about since October 7th. All the hostages and detainees that Israel has killed in their effort to supposedly rescue them. Now, this was in the area of Gaza, and Israeli media published a leaked audio from the IDF soldiers of 2 Israeli hostages yelling for them to save them, but the IDF killed them instead. Just like the ones holding the SOS sign, I'll show you next, and all those shot elsewhere by the IDF during and after October 7th. Now, all you hear on this, which you can listen for yourself, this is one of the Israelis describing this and saying that they were shot. They basically say they're laying there saying, "Please help us," and you hear them come in and you hear pop, 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 and it's gone. And he's the one giving you context and saying that they shot them. Here is, I'm gonna keep that open actually. An example, this is one from Merav Zonzin from 972 magazine, a scathing report, an independent Israeli site, and it is the, I think, Makom, exposes that 10 hostages, actually, by looks, I believe all of them were actually military targets, maybe save for her, I forget, but I think they were all IDF members, were killed by Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. This was on February 21st. Some, even as IDF, had intel that they were residing in these buildings and were targeted anyway. And this is coming from the reports from 972 magazine, where they have these AI programs. This one was Hapsora. The other one's called Lavender. And this is the most highly surveilled area on the planet. So they know these people are there, and they killed them anyway. The IDF reported that they died in Hamas captivity. See how this works? Hamas did it. Probably at the beginning, whether it was Hannibal Directive or not, they realized, but they just bomb everywhere. If they killed them, we'll blame it on Hamas. And then every single one of these people that have come back have told the almost exact opposite story of what we're told. They were raped. They were tortured. They were no. Well, it turns out they were treated kindly. They were given. They let out to shop. They were baked a cake. In some cases, they were. The point is, they said the exact opposite. That's why you get Elon Levy and the rest now watering down their narrative. They've enslaved everybody. Okay, sir, that's probably bad if that's actually what happened. But funny how you went from rape and torture, rape dungeons to doing the dishes, which is what he's actually arguing, because that's what that comes from. They made them do the dishes. Oh, they're slaves. Well, sure, they were kidnapped, right? Or taken as detainees. Either way, that's a scary reality. But they're being killed by their own people. This is one of the most incredible parts of this. I've gone over this so many times. Here's BBC. That's the actual sign they were holding. Painted with food, I guess, or something. Hostages shot by the IDF. They were all IDF members. 3 IDF detainees or PLWs were shot by the IDF while holding an SOS sign. Right? And very clearly, at least based on, look, these people right here. You could argue that at the very least, they would be, because they were talking in Hebrew, saying we're Israeli hostages, and frankly don't look Palestinian for most of them, that they knew. Now, you could argue, fine, they didn't know, even though we now know they do and provably had orders to shoot anything that moves. That was their orders. But then the point is, 2 of them got shot. One of them managed to get away. And I don't know if you've read this or you've heard me say this, but hear this. They shot 2 of them. One of them got away. It took 15 minutes, according to BBC, 15 minutes for them to coax him back out. And he's the whole time, don't shoot me, I'm a hostage, in Hebrew. And when he came back out, when they convinced him to come back out because they said they wouldn't shoot him, 2 of them shot him dead. I don't know how anybody with a brain cannot see what that shows us. Not maybe you could argue not everybody, but these ones murdered those people by orders or not. There's no way around it. Omar Badar highlights the Israeli military has now rescued a total of 7. This was June 8th. And, of course, killed 70 of their own hostages. Their kill-to-rescue ratio stands at 10-1. That's not just failing, guys. That's murder. And the bottom line is that in the last 4, as you remember, they killed 3 to get those 4 back. And, of course, 274 innocent people, mostly women and children. He says you can only deem this a success if you share the Israeli government's view that the destruction of Gaza is worth more than the lives of their own people. Read this, of course, 972, Mass Assassination Factory. There's 6 former and current IDF members as sources. And they say things like we were bringing down buildings just to bring down buildings, that they were definitely killing civilians, and it was not about hostages or anything other than destroying Gaza and fear. And of course, the ones that have come back have been pretty consistent. We were constantly in terror of the IDF bombings, which is what she's talking about. And it says worried at times that she and her daughter and Tal, 9 years old, would be killed by the Israeli offensive. They were more afraid of that than their captors, who, by the way, once shielded the family with their bodies as shrapnel rained around them. Exactly what Noah told us, Argamani, I believe, that the Hamas member who was supposed to be raping and torturing them, in fact, put his body in the way to protect her. Not, you could argue not because they cared about him, but because they want to exchange them for their own hostages. But in any case, quite a different story than what Elon Levy screeches about every day, right? Asaf MD highlights the same one we just showed you. This is one that just came back. The last 4, then when they killed 3. Our greatest fear was Israeli planes. He says, and did this give you hope or shake your confidence? He says, our greatest fear was the IDF planes and their concern that they would bomb the building we were in. He said, so you made your peace with the fact that you may not come out alive and death did not scare you, but your greatest fear was from IDF activity, correct? And he goes, yes, from the IDF. Here's a clip from Propaganda & Co. We played before, but I think it's also important. Again, a little bit of redundancy, but I think this is well done. Israel wants to kill the hostages, he says. I agree.
Have been told that Israel wants to save the hostages. Captured on October 7th. But what if you've been lied to? What if Israel's war cabinet has no intention of saving them. An investigative journalist made a bombshell discovery. Filmmaker and journalist Dan Cohen acquired secret recordings of the Netanyahu government pressuring Israeli families to sacrifice their children in Gaza in order for the genocide to continue, so that Israel can conquer and colonize Gaza for good. Stick around, because I'm about to reveal the sickening details of this explosive investigation that confirms Israel's policy of sacrificing their own people. And you'll be surprised to hear that this theory is supported by prominent Israelis and has been reported by Israeli media. Yes, you heard that right. Israeli media. Now, I'm sure you've heard about the controversial Hannibal Directive, which is the Israeli doctrine of killing their own people to prevent the Palestinians from using them as bargaining chips during negotiations and prisoner swaps. The Hannibal Directive is a doctrine of sacrifice named after the Carthaginian general, who was one of the single greatest threats to Rome to ever live. For years, Hannibal delivered blow after humiliating blow to the Roman Empire. And even after the fall of Carthage, Hannibal swore an oath of revenge. So the Romans chased Hannibal across the world, hoping to capture him. But when they got close to doing just that, Hannibal decided he would rather die than allow himself to be captured, and so swallowed a vial of poison that he always kept with him just for such a situation. Israel sees killing its own citizens in much the same way, so as to deny their enemies any leverage during negotiations. Now, while it was speculated by many in the aftermath of October 7th that Israel implemented the Hannibal Directive, it has now become crystal clear, even irrefutable through Israeli media no less, that Israel had done exactly that.
נוהל חניבל כנראה הופעל באיזשהו שלב, כי ברגע שהבינו שיש חטיפה, אז הם מיד אומרים, חבר'ה, זה חניבל.
But what if I told you this mass Hannibal is still happening? That it has been happening every day since October 7th? What if I told you that a major aim of the genocide in Gaza was in fact the continuation of this mass Hannibal? On January 15th, the Palestinians released a video of Israeli hostage Noah Argamani. Noah says that she had been injured in an Israeli airstrike and was trapped under the rubble for 2 whole days. She also says that 2 other Israeli hostages had been killed by Israeli strikes, one buried underneath the rubble and the other in a moving ambulance in Gaza.
Now remember, this was a while ago, guys. She's now been freed and says the same thing. Remember what they said when they first put this out? It's Hamas propaganda. They're forcing them to say it. Well, really what they're projecting is what they do to their hostages, which is torture them. One of which I'll talk about tomorrow was a doctor who died being tortured to death by Shin Bet 7 days after they kidnapped him. Not a Hamas member. That's Haaretz putting that out, by the way. We'll talk about that tomorrow. The point is that they pretend, oh, she's lying. That's not true. Well, yeah, she's still saying it right now. So just let that flavor what we continue to hear from the lies from Israel and the fact that Hamas seems to have allowed these people. I mean, the point is, some of them have said that they were forced to say these things, but the point is what they said was ultimately not false. But they still made them say it on video. But these statements they made are true. And they've held those afterward. Continued to back this up after they were released. So it's only, I mean, again, that doesn't have to mean Hamas good guy. It just continues to show how many times they've been shown to be not the one lying. It's kind of easy to see.
She implored Netanyahu to stop this madness and bring us home to our families. But these aren't the only Israeli hostages who have been killed or injured. According to Hamas, nearly 60 hostages have been killed by Israeli strikes. Several Israeli hostages released by Hamas have described the terror of being held in Gaza, unsure of whether or not they'd be killed by their own government.
את כל הפיצוצים של ישראל, פיצוצים מאוד גדולים. היה המון פעמים שאמרתי לעצמי, בסוף אני ימות מהטילים של ישראל.
I'll die from Israel's missiles and not Hamas. Don't forget, there's even, I think it was Haaretz or was at least Israeli media articles that highlighted some of them have permanent hearing damage. So think about what this does to the random Palestinian civilians that are also dealing with this every day, nonstop, this entire time, and also decades before this.
ולא מהחמאס.
An Israeli sociologist and military expert, Yagil Levy, told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that Israel is indeed trying to carry out a mass Hannibal. The government's decision to attack Gaza, despite the presence of hostages in the bombed sites, can be considered an extension of the Hannibal procedure. That is, an attempt to thwart the continuation of the captivity, even at the cost of risking the lives of the hostages. The obvious explanation is that the right perceives the pressure to stop the fighting as endangering the pursuit of victory and revenge in Gaza. And therefore, the lives of the abductees are another reasonable sacrifice that must be made. A reasonable and necessary sacrifice to justify the Gaza genocide. Gilad Shalit was a captured Israeli soldier that the Palestinians traded for over 1,000 Palestinians. In an interview with the Israeli media outlet Shomrim, an unnamed figure who was involved in the Gilad Shalit exchange said that Israel was invoking the Hannibal Directive. He says, Hamas expected this to be a repeat of the Shalit case. They thought that they would kidnap Israelis and that we would cave in. But the state of Israel has implemented the Hannibal Directive on the whole of the Gaza Strip. Now, as you can imagine, the families of the hostages are not happy about this. They want their loved ones to be brought home. They're angry, and they have been organizing massive demonstrations, calling on Netanyahu to strike a deal and end the war.
What's funny about this video very well could be made today. This video was put out months ago. That's how clear this has been the entire time.
To save their loved ones and live up to their promise of bringing them home.
And yet all these screaming Zionists online, the ones we've always referenced, continue to pretend that we're the ones making this up and that everybody supports what's going on and we're all just racist, Jew-hating maniacs. Even though what we're doing is, in fact, we're arguing alongside the Israeli Jews that are calling for their families to come back. You know, what the point is, it's about anybody murdering innocent people. You know, call me a racist for hiding people that murder innocent people. Sure. You know, the bottom line is it's obvious this is not about Jewish or Christian or Israeli, or it's about people who are murdering innocent people. Simple as that. And it always has been, right? And it's of course, right now I can clearly align this with very clear Zionist agendas, but there's Christian Zionists, there's Jewish Zionists, there's people that aren't Zionists that are okay with this happening. The point is we're fighting that. We're fighting this kind of allowance of power, driving this forward without any justification while screaming that they're fighting for freedom. That's what we're fighting.
Was supposedly a key objective for Israel in this war. And some of the demonstrators are former hostages themselves.
Right.
And so Netanyahu has been gaslighting the families of these hostages to convince them to sacrifice their own children so that he can achieve his political ambition of conquering Gaza and ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from it. You see, to Netanyahu and his cabinet, the families of the hostages are nothing but an obstacle that stands in the way of Israel's genocide in Gaza. But more importantly to him, they are endangering his political career. In a private meeting between Netanyahu and the family of the hostages, several far right-wing extremists whose family members were also taken hostage were brought in to try and convince everyone else that their pain should be set aside for the greater interests of the Israeli state. One of these far right-wing extremists, Ohad Zvi Lapidot, addressed the families. This is a secret audio recording of that exchange.
Put out by Uncaptured Media. Get going.
Outraged, a mother of one of the hostages responded. What Lapidot said next set fire to the room.
He said there is a chess game, there are pawns. That's what he said about their family members. And they said, but it's not pawns. It's not pawns. It's children. It's our people. It's babies, civilian population. That's what they said. This is months ago. So this is at a time when we're trying to highlight the fact they don't care about these people, that they're at the very least secondary, which is their own quotes, by the way. And yet you get called race. You get censored in some places for making these provable points, just like we did during COVID-19.
חיילים, זה לא חיילים, זה ילדים. ילדים וזקנים, קשישים, תינוקות. זה לא מלחמה, לעשות דיון פוליטי.
Now, as you can clearly tell, there is division amongst the families. Yet, after the meeting, the far right-wing extremist family members in support of Netanyahu, sacrificing their children for conquest, went outside and spoke directly to the media, pretending to represent all of the families that had met with Netanyahu.
אני אמרתי לכולם, גם אני מאוד מאוד אוהב את הבן שלי. אבל אם אני צריך לבחור בין הבן שלי, בין אהבת...
Basically saying we need to choose between these things, you know, pretending that they're on the side of whatever the Israeli government's doing. We need to fight against Hamas at all costs. They've been lying to you. They've been gaslighting even their own people from the very beginning. This is why they've lost control.
הבן שלי לבין אהבת האומה, אני בוחר באהבת האומה. אנחנו נשדר את החוזק. אנחנו עכשיו נקראים לדגל, ואם צריך להקריב את הקורבן, אנחנו נקריב את הקורבן.
By dividing the families and using guilt to dissuade them from standing in his way and then lying to both the public and the media, Netanyahu seeks to maintain his position that Gaza must be completely wiped off the map. This psyop, this lie, this betrayal of the families of the hostages of the Israeli citizenry, who are nothing but pawns to Israeli leadership, is how Netanyahu has been able to convince Israeli society to continue the war. Ever since this psyop took place, Netanyahu's war cabinet has implemented a mass Hannibal policy in Gaza, wiping out their hostages and removing all obstacles to the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people. In one case, the IDF used poison gas to kill an Israeli hostage being held in an underground tunnel. In a chilling social media post, the mother of the murdered hostage said her son crushed his fingers trying to dig his way out of the tunnel before choking to death on the poisonous gas. She rightly asks, if it were Netanyahu's son being held hostage, would the IDF have acted so recklessly? She went on to say that there is no future for this country after what they did to you. This poor mother raises an important point. What is the point of establishing a safe home for the Jews and expanding your territory through conquest for your own people if you have to murder your own people to achieve it?
החזרת החטופים לא הולך ביחד. אמרנו, הלחימה מסכנת אותם והלחימה הורגת אותם. 29 יום הוא שרד שם, בחיים, בסיוט, בזוועה, זוועת עולם. בשביל שפשוט יהרגו אותו. אומרים שהחזרת החטופים זה בראש סדרי עדיפויות. ואם לא, אז משקרים לנו כל הזמן. וזה מה שזאת האמת. פשוט משקרים לנו, מקריבים אותם, מוותרים עליהם, עליי ויתרו, לגמרי.
There is so much more in this bombshell investigation conducted by Dan Cohen, so check out the link to his article. And remember, we all know that the algorithm censors and bans content like this, so we need your help to spread the word.
Yes, we do. Here is Dan Cohen's overview of this before I think it was in this breakdown, and this is from January 17th. No U.S. media outlets are reporting the massive scandal, and this was January 18th, that Israel killed a captive soldier with poison gas and then lied to his family about it to blame Hamas. Just, things that are, it's this transparent when the mother's speaking out, that you can see how clearly the corporate media and our political spectrum is just completely blinded or co-opted by what we'll go over more tomorrow. Whether it's the AIPAC dynamic or Zionism, we're watching this completely co-opted Congress discussion or government in general. And that's not some racist, buzzword trope zog conversation. We're talking about provable examples of government entities and politics and money influencing the outcome of policy in a foreign country. The game of trying to wash that away as you're just using some trope is lazy, pseudo-intellectual nonsense. Yes, there is a trope that people use that is meant to make all Jews look bad. Yeah, and that's what we're trying to show is a manipulation to hide what we're talking about. My point is that this is very obvious, that we could see that they're being manipulated to such a degree that they're unwilling to point about. I mean, the mother herself was calling this out. That was the story. And yet, what did they all do? Lied. Only Israeli media was covering at the time, and very few. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, and the rest of them were covering it up so they didn't embarrass the Israeli government. Those are the same outlets that promote the beheaded babies and mass rape lies. The media is part of the Zionist death cult, he highlights. But says mother of Israeli hostage accuses army of poisoning her son to death. Jerusalem Post, IDF fails to confirm Gaza hostage's cause of death. Mother claimed poison. The truth is, it's very clear, and it's been shown after the fact. I covered this in January 20th, 2024. Israeli hostage killed with poison gas. One after another after another. Electronic Intifada highlights a great documentary that's from Al Jazeera that I'll include for you to watch from March 11th. Very powerful. Of course, it's been censored by YouTube. Now we're going to end with watching some of this. This is the one I've talked about for a while. Interestingly enough, it has gotten a lot more attention, but it was only like 100 something views the first time I saw this. October 7th was an inside job by John Hankey, hashtag Real History Channel. So we're going to watch this. And then I'm going to end with that clip just because it's a clip from John Ritter about the Hannibal Directive. But we're going to watch some of this. I'm not sure how long we'll go on it, but I want to watch some of this. I was kind of aiming at 2 hours, so maybe go a little bit longer than 5 more minutes, but let's watch some of this. But I highly recommend you watch this because there's so many nuanced points about the timing of the different security checkpoints and a lot. Maybe I'll let a lot more play than I think, but let's go into it a little bit. I don't really plan on stopping it a lot, but I probably will. But make sure you continue to watch because I'm not done.
Israel was completely behind the October 7th attacks, organized, funded, and enabled by Israel. Watching just a few of these images tells you that the nation of Israel has become a fascist, genocidal monstrosity. But the paid defenders of Israeli genocide say that it's necessary to kill all those kids because of the terrible crimes committed by Hamas on October 7th.
Killing Hamas makes Israel safer.
Yeah, Hamas is responsible for killing all those children. Hamas kills children. Hamas is an evil organization. I hope Israel destroys Hamas. That's what I hope, and I want to help Israel destroy Hamas.
But these two Israeli army veterans want us to know that the whole story of October 7th is a lie, and they are furious about it.
Israel is probably the most advanced surveillance state in the world. And the Gaza border is probably the most heavily surveilled. I know all these things firsthand because I served on the Gaza border. Do you know how long it takes an attack helicopter to get activated and blow up any one of those tractors or pickup trucks? Less than 5 minutes. It could have been a matter of 5 minutes before the whole thing was upended. I'm sorry, that's an inside job.
I am an Israeli. I live in Jerusalem. I was serving in the army. I was in intelligence unit. Defense is guarded 24/7, not only by patrolling cars, not only by cameras, not only by a fence that is an electric fence, also by a laser that is activating an alarms. Nobody can cross that fence. You cannot enter unless you have help from inside. There was help from inside. This operation was not made by Hamas. The plan is to flatten Gaza. Let's talk the truth.
These two Israeli army veterans are mad, and they say Israel's defenses should have stopped the invaders.
That's Yasmin Porat, by the way, for the same one that was talking before about shooting the house.
Let's look at these supposedly impenetrable border defenses that they are talking about, shall we? The wall is steel-reinforced concrete, 20 feet high and 22 miles long. In front of it is a minor fence, and behind it is a $2 billion electrified steel fence. Every few hundred yards there are machine gun turrets, patrolled 24/7 by soldiers, all of it backed up with an array of devices for detecting anyone approaching the fence. These devices include radar systems with cameras that cover the entire territory of the Gaza Strip, night vision cameras, of course, a system of lasers for detecting movement, super high-def cameras that can see faces close up from 6 miles away. The cameras are located atop surveillance towers. Many of these cameras are mounted in balloons, allowing the spotters to see deep into Hamas's backyard. A small army of spotters monitor these cameras.
Those balloons with cameras. I wonder if that maybe Israel's spying on the White House and wherever those weather balloons from China were supposedly flying around. Just an interesting thought. The whole the balloon thing probably just seems like a psyop or some kind of distraction, but who knows? There's a lot of overlaps to the Stinger devices, the White House, the times so many times Israel's been caught spying on the United States and just ignores it, sort of like a USS Liberty, but, when spying.
Intensely, 24/7. And the spotters reported that they could see training camps, which are as far from the border as you can get. Before you're out of range of these cameras, you're in the sea. The cameras send a picture of any intruder to the spotters, who then send the information to the soldiers who operate the machine gun towers by remote control with devastating effect. These machine gun turrets should have exterminated the Hamas invaders when they first approached the fence. But the soldiers manning them had been evacuated before the attack on the morning of October 7th. All except the soldiers manning this one. Accidents happen, I guess. The whole perimeter is patrolled 24 hours a day on the ground, including tanks, and from the air, of course. And backing this whole system is a battery of 28 Apache helicopters, capable of flying 200 miles an hour, firing 600 explosive 30-millimeter machine gun rounds per minute, plus Hellfire missiles, and
less than 5 minutes
away from Gaza. Paratroopers on call and ready to be flown in anywhere in minutes. The military base near the Gaza border is capable of responding within minutes with 200 soldiers armed to the teeth. And of course the bombers, currently murdering children in Gaza, would arrive in seconds after takeoff. If one of these multiple standard defense measures had been in operation, active on the morning of October 7th, the attacks would have had zero chance of breaching the wall alive, much less hurting anyone on the other side of the wall.
And that's one of the main points, is that there was a huge hours-long gap where nothing happened. There's just no way that makes sense to anybody with any knowledge about even the surface level things that are capable, right? Their security apparatus. As somebody's pointing out in the chat, which is kind of the main point here, is that based on everything we're seeing, it really does come down to, in my opinion, whether this was, as the terms go, lie hop, my hop, right? Let it happen on purpose or made it happen on purpose. It's beginning to seem like the latter, right? Because if it's just let it happen on purpose, there's a lot of unanswered questions or just red flags and anomalies that don't really add up for how Hamas would have just planned. It seems to me that overlapping it with the point of whether there's still influence at some level from Israel on this group, and ultimately drove this into reality, and then, maybe a combination of both, right? Made it happen, but then let that happen, So I don't even know what that would be called. But clearly, I think it's obvious this was not some random organic event. That's my opinion, but I think the evidence is overwhelming.
As we are about to see, Hamas had been on the warpath for 40 minutes before the sun came up. The helicopters should have been in the air 35 minutes before this video was taken. Given that the attack was already underway at this point, these guys should have been obliterated as they first left town and started down the dirt roads to the fence. But we're just getting started.
They're called in Hebrew Tatzpitanot, which is basically the command and control center. These are the people, mostly females, who who's tasked with observing the Gaza border fence. There's actual video footage of those same command control center operators reporting on the breach of the fence. They did, and it's documented.
From the very start of the attack, the balloons allowed these spotters to see the pickups the minute these Hamas fighters started off from deep inside Gaza. And these women called it in. We saw people running to the border from every direction, running with guns. We saw motorbikes and pickup trucks driving straight at the fence. We watched them blow up the fence and destroy it. And we might have been crying, but we continued to do our jobs at the same time. We were taught that we would report on the incident, we would direct helicopters to the scene, and someone would come and save us. But the helicopters never came. The spotters' tiny base was overrun. 15 were killed and 7 were taken hostages. These spotters are, of course, furious. The IDF left us like sitting ducks on a range. The spotters who had been abandoned by the army were simply slaughtered. This Washington Post PBS documentary has something to tell us about the cameras on the balloons.
Video from the attack shows one of the balloons. We were told it had been cut loose by the militants.
So one of the bazillion lies Israel has told about the attack is that the spotters couldn't see the attackers because their cameras had been cut. That is a lie. The balloons were not detached. The spotters saw Hamas coming, and they continued reporting even as Hamas attacked their unguarded facility. But these army spotters were not the only ones calling in red alerts. Israelis living near the wall heard the explosions at the wall. They saw the rockets and called in 30 red alerts.
So think about the timing of calling in, seeing these things happen, calling it in, and then having hours of time where nothing happens. There's no way that adds up.
יושב בשולחן, 6:30, מטח רקטות וצבע אדום, מטורף, מטורף. אנחנו לא זוכרים משהו בכזו אינטות לכיוון צפון, רקטות שנופלות פה, פצמרים, הכל, כל השמיים בוערים, ממש בוערים.
In fact, at 6 a.m., people as far away as Jerusalem saw this massive, unprecedented firing of rockets and were terrified, as Our Lady veteran friend recalls for us.
I live in Jerusalem, specifically in the center, and I saw those things from already at 6 in the morning. And I knew about it at 6 in the morning, me, right now as a citizen. How, explain to me how the army didn't know it and they didn't come to help those people?
Hamas began launching rockets before sunrise, at least half an hour before any of the explosions at the wall, or trucks or motorcycles heading for the fence. And, early as it was, there were earlier alarms from Israeli intelligence in the middle of the night that Hamas was on the move. You've likely heard about the Nova Music Festival that was attacked and 350 people murdered, mostly burned alive. Lawyers for the victims have brought a lawsuit. There's much more to this story that we'll get to later, but for now, let's just focus on the fact that the lawsuit blames the army for failing to notify concert-goers when signs of a possible Hamas attack emerged late the night before on Friday, October 6. The military concedes that there was unusual activity by Hamas that was detected and discussed, and decisions were made, though obviously those decisions were not to beef up defenses, but to remove them. I'm on the side of the lawyers that this is incomprehensible, how the defendants did not order the party to be dispersed immediately. In fact, I find incomprehensible to be the only word to describe all this stuff. You will too, I think. For example, the women soldiers, the spotters, also heard this story about how the security services were warning about a terrorist infiltration and increased the presence of special forces and placed these various units on alert. The few surviving spotters are furious that they were not alerted or evacuated, but were left like sitting ducks, completely unarmed and defenseless, for the Hamas invaders to slaughter. You may not be surprised at this point to learn that this warning Friday night was also not the first alarm. The Washington Post and PBS sent 2 reporters on a mission to Israel to investigate how Hamas was able to penetrate Israel's impenetrable defenses. One of the first things they learned, however, was the fact that detailed plans and all sorts of training videos had been posted online in the weeks before the attacks.
The plan that...
Again, from a tactical, strategic perspective, and look, whatever your thoughts on Hamas, I've learned enough from Robert and others that have studied this for a long time to know that they're not the hyperbolic framing that it's like pretending Iran is just a bunch of savages in caves. No, they're highly technologically advanced. Iran. The point is, similar game with Hamas. They're not what they claim that they are. That's just not to say that they're as advanced, let's say, as plenty of overlaps. My point, though, is that I do not understand why any of them would have logically argued that would make sense. Why would we post this online before some unprecedented operation? Where it just doesn't make any sense. And that's the kind of thing that the casual viewer overlooks because, well, there must be a narrative, must be an explanation. Israel says because X, Y, and Z. But just be logical for a second. That doesn't add up. With everything else we've seen, that is why I keep continuing to think that there's something in this that is collaboration between all or parts of that group. I just can't overlook that. But I'm not saying I know that for sure. Just something I want us to continue to ask. And my opinion, if I'm forced to pick, would be, and it's my opinion because it's not proven yet, that again, that there's an element of this group that is compromised, which goes back to the idea that they were clearly funded, and I argue their leadership is clearly still protected in Qatar, but funded by the Israeli government, which is easy to prove. I've played the clip 4,500 times, as well as the fact that it's on record that Netanyahu said that to his own Likud party in their meeting in 2019, that we have to keep funding them to make sure that the two-state solution doesn't happen. Paraphrasing, because that's exactly what they never wanted to allow while always pretending that's what they wanted.
As we discovered, had been brewing in plain sight.
When I first saw this video, I was like, oh, this is video from the day of. Like, how did they get this produced out so quickly? And then once you look closer, it's obviously a training video.
Our investigation found multiple videos recorded by Hamas detailing their planning measures. Posted on social media before the attack, visible to all. We found videos of militants training for attacks on mock-ups of Israeli compounds. Videos posted soon after the attack showed they had also been practicing the use of paragliders.
These same women soldiers, the spotters, told the leading newspapers in Israel that for a month and a half before the October 7 attack, they saw Hamas training camps where they had built an exact replica of machine gun towers just like the ones in the fence. The incidents they saw were not isolated, and they were not tiny, they were massive. They'd never seen anything like it. They didn't just report, they yelled at their commanders that the reports had to be taken seriously, that Hamas was training for an attack. Congressional leaders were told.
And remember, they came to the point to where they literally threatened in one case to arrest them or lock them up if they kept pushing the issue. To me, that suggests a level of foreknowledge in that, maybe all across the board, but very clearly at some level to where he knew and we're supposed to allow this. Like that's what I genuinely think. I don't know how else you would explain that kind of disregard. Now, maybe to some degree, but when they kept stressing it, and they kept saying, look, we can see them. They're literally, like, whether you think they're benign or they're not capable of it or not, that kind of disregard is just, I guess you could argue the lack of discipline and what we've seen so far would make that, even with what we've seen, I still argue that's just not likely that they would ignore it to that degree unless there was a reason for it.
By U.S. intelligence that Israel had been warned by the Egyptians, their closest ally in the region, 3 days before the attack. The Egyptians confirmed this story. They'd warned Israel of a coming explosion and that it would be big. The New York Times reported that Israeli officials obtained Hamas's battle plan more than a year before the attack. This planning document was 40 pages long and detailed point by point exactly the kind of devastating attack that was coming. Holy crap. Israel's own analysts also noted the day-long training exercises that the spotters had seen, which fully matched the Hamas battle plan.
This evidence was largely ignored or dismissed by Israeli intelligence and the military, our investigation found.
Largely ignored. Largely is not the right word. Hell, completely is not the right word. They didn't ignore all this information that we just spent the last 15 minutes reviewing. As we are about to see, they very much responded to it by withdrawing 99% of the defenses, leaving those individuals that the Israeli Secret Intelligence Services, the Mossad, had chosen to die, completely unprotected, lambs chosen to be slaughtered.
Mm-hmm. So right there is the same dynamic we were talking about. It's not even, I wouldn't even call it the Hannibal Directive. You're sacrificing these people. It could be out of disregard because you're not valuable to you. But like the Nova Festival, these people were left in a location with forewarned information, knowing this, at least in the moment, then recognizing, oh, they were right, but I think it was more than that, allowed these people to be taken out. This is why any Israeli that's becoming aware of this information is furious, is recognizing who the actual enemy is, whether or not you still see Hamas as an enemy. You're talking about the enemy within, the reality that your own government is using you like chess pieces, pawns in a game. And still just showing all of the different faces of the people that were sacrificed. Some of which, by the way, right there, were taken and then claimed that Hamas did X, Y, and Z. They got left out to dry by their own government. That's one of those. That's, I think, two of the ones that have already come back. Nanya Levy. This one. Daniela Gilboa. These are all the ones that were on those surveillance locations. Remember the 4 that were caught dancing and then taken by Hamas? Again, it's not to say that everyone were on October 7th. The point is that these were people that were left out to dry. All Israeli defenses were completely absent for the first 6 hours.
This video is mind-boggling. You have to please note at the top of the screen that the New York Times calls this base the heart of all military operations along the Gaza border. What you are seeing take place is this massive attack launched by Hamas upon this completely abandoned military base.
Mm-hmm.
And I count at least 5 and maybe 7 Hamas fighters. We were told there were over 1,000. WTF is up with that? And look at the length of this guy's shadow. This is not dawn. The sun is well up. It's at least an hour past dawn.
Right.
Maybe 2.
With rockets.
Nearly 3 hours after the rockets, and well over an hour after the first attack on the fences.
Right, with the most surveilled area in the world. It doesn't take much to recognize that there was something letting this happen.
In response to the news of an impending attack, the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, withdrew the military completely from Gaza.
I'm sorry, that's an inside job.
Again, these women were purposefully murdered by the IDF on orders from the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. You need to reorient your thinking, I believe, to recognize that everyone who died on October 7th was murdered as part of this plan by the Mossad to justify genocide in Gaza. So, you might expect these women weren't the only soldiers set up like lambs for the slaughter.
Now, just to be clear, I believe when this was made, these people were still up in the air, right? Like they were either presumed to have been kidnapped or possibly killed. Just so it's clear why some of those were in there and he's talking about them being killed. The point is they were left out to dry, allowed to be taken, if you think of it like that. Now, apparently some of them have now come back, right? But many of them were probably killed or still being held, but they're all IDF members. Those are military targets. Your government left you out there.
The New York Times also reports that although the defenses at the base were removed, many soldiers were not only left behind, but they were allowed to keep sleeping.
Wow.
Several were killed in their bunks. The death of these soldiers was not an accident. Where was the IDF? Asked the New York Times. It was part of a plan that was so insanely obvious that the New York Times couldn't resist asking. In all these videos of Hamas, where's the goddamned Israeli army? This body cam video was taken by Hamas operatives. It shows them driving miles to the border fence, kicking up dust the whole way in full view of the Israeli spotters who saw it and reported it. In order to have any credibility, official Israeli television has had to admit what everyone in Israel already knew, that the military disappeared as this tiny invasion took place.
A stopwatch counting from the first explosion until the moment terrorist squad number 1 crosses into Israel shows 7.5 minutes. In that time, they meet no Israeli resistance.
Now, just to address like what one of the thoughts that we get, and somebody in the chat's pointing it out, that we get this from, the general, and it's certainly possible. that really they just never thought they were capable, whatever they were planning, so they just kind of disregarded it, right? And certainly possibly somebody at some level maybe all did that. I don't agree, but it's possible. My point would then be, though, in this time frame. So you disregarded it, but then you see the rockets fly when it's still dark outside. Then you see the different explosions. You see the different actions. Hours go by and still no one's there. So I don't know how we can still make that argument. Even if they did disregard it, where did they go? Why didn't they come back? Hours are going by and people are being raided and kidnapped. I mean, there's just no way around it. They either hid as cowards or they knowingly let this happen at some kind of leadership level. I really don't know how else we could argue that anything other than that, quite frankly.
Let's revisit this crucial point. At this point in the video where we see this explosion in the distance, terrorist squad number 1 had already been on their way for some time, and the spotters would have seen all of their movements. So, the spotters said that they gave warning to the IDF immediately, and this would have been well over 7.5 minutes before Hamas arrived at the wall. And yet...
In that time, they meet no Israeli resistance.
And what about the machine gun towers placed every few hundred yards? One of which we see in action here. These guns would have evaporated those guys in the trucks when they were still hundreds of yards away. You remember we were told that special teams mobilized at 4 a.m.? My guess is that these special teams were Mossad operatives, mobilized to remove all the soldiers who would have otherwise operated these guns.
Now, I'm going to leave it there, but one other point you could argue here could be that those Mossad operatives who are famous for dressing and pretending to be Palestinians very well could have been some of the ones carrying out some of the most grotesque things that we saw. I'm not saying that's necessarily provable, but we know that this is what they've shown themselves to be capable of, and we've clearly proven them lying about some of the atrocities, framing this as something it's not, allowing this to continue, putting their own people at risk. That's just something that we have to consider. But in any case, to wrap just at this point, I want to highlight something somebody said in the chat, which I think is actually really interesting, just well framed. He says that we do gain a function on radical groups and use them in the same way. You know, thinking about the way that whatever your thoughts about, terrain germ theory, whatever else, just as an analogy, the idea of taking something dangerous and manipulating it in order to make it exponentially more dangerous and then acting surprised when something hurt. Like, you could argue the way both the U.S. government, these different groups, the Israeli group, government funding Hamas into this position, where that's exactly what we're talking about. You're taking the most dangerous and molding it into something even more dangerous and then using it for your own purposes. You know, whether or not the dangerous thing is aware that they're being molded, it's the same point. But in any case, guys, I think it's very obvious that this alone, more than enough evidence just here, just what we're looking at today, to show you that we're being lied to. And I don't even need to convince any of you. I mean, quite frankly, I think most of you here are already on the same page. But if you weren't and you just watched what we went through and you're still pretending like the day one narrative, the day to the 5-month narrative, the 9-month narrative is even remotely true, I just think you're lying to yourself. And I think we need to continue, as always, questioning everything while simultaneously considering all the possibilities, whether it be from corporate media, from Israel, from Hamas, from independent media. Just consider everything while questioning it all the same. And I think if you're doing that, it's near impossible to think that what they're saying is true, because they're lying. They're being proven to be lying. And pretty much even from within the mainstream elements, are showing them to be lying to you on a daily basis. So we're going to get to a lot of this more tomorrow, a lot more deep dives on different parts of the conversation. But I just felt this was necessary time to do this. And we've already done this more than once, but not with this much, 9 months of ongoing research and evidence. Now, I highly recommend you watch the rest of that documentary. It goes on to cover a lot of great nuanced points. But the one that really stood out to me was the sacrificing of the people, mostly, I think all women, on these surveillance locations, at a time when they were claiming that they were the ones being murdered and raped and tortured by the very people that, again, they let have at these people. It's just, even if what they're saying is true, they let that happen. It's just something very, very dark and wrong about all of this. And I think it's important that we recognize what this stems back to. And your government, pretty much around the world, has been supporting, bolstering, lying for, arming this entity for a long time now. And we're talking about Zionism, guys. We're not talking about Israelis or Jews or Christians. We're talking about Zionism, which clearly overlaps all of those things. And it is a problem. And I think it's something that most people in the world are beginning to recognize. You can scream all you want about how that's the same as Jewish people. It's just not. It's a lie. Judaism is a 1,000+ year old religion. We're talking about something that's been around for 150 years at most. Or, there's definitely arguments around that, but the main form we see it today. And the reality being that this is something that is a political ideology that is clearly right in line and has aligned itself more than once with groups like Nazi Germany, like Stalin at the same time, overlap with genocides all over the world like Bosnia and Rwanda, and the one you're literally watching play out right now. This will be remembered no matter what they say now, and already is, as the genocide of 2024. And we will not forget this. And I think what's most important is that the Israeli people watching recognize that you're a part of that. You are part of the 2024 genocide. Your families, your children were killed or allowed to be killed by what your government did to you, and is now continuing to do to Palestinians right now on the ground, starving them, bombing them. I mean, so many much darker things they're doing on the ground that we can't even get into. So I just hope that we can continue to highlight this, because as always, I feel a positive change and momentum coming from this, right? It's as much as we cover so many really terrible and dark and sad things, almost all of it stems from the reality that by doing this, we're changing things for the better. And it's not always as easy to see, because some of these things are hard to watch, but I see it right now. I see an opportunity. People are seeing through, just like during the COVID conversation, they're seeing through the partisan mindlessness. They're seeing through the lies of their governments. And maybe tomorrow that'll go away. Maybe a new thing will shift it right back. But I see the opening. And I just plead with you out there to stand back from your political biases. We all have them, myself included, and just try to recognize that we're all fighting the same thing. Left, right, Christian, Jew, it's Muslim. We're all fighting the evil in the world. And it's just time for us to recognize that, whether that's the governments we're talking about from the US and what they're doing overseas, or Zionist in Israel, or other governments that they're working with, or the terrorist groups they've created. It's time to fight the problem together and stop letting them divide us along our culture war party lines and everything else they're using. And that includes the people in the two-party illusion screaming to keep you stuck in the status quo. So thank you for tuning in today. Please share the information, make the clips of this, talk about this with your friends and family, discuss it, debate it, break it down. It's important. And if you want to continue to see work like this, there's lots of ways to support us down below in the video. Support us on thelastamericanvagabond.com, on our Substack, on all sorts of different ways, because we do need your support, because work like this gets attacked more than anything I've ever seen in my life. But I'm going to keep doing it because I think it's important, and you believe in us. So I believe in you. Thank you for being here. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
So are you saying Benjamin Netanyahu deliberately boosted Hamas to try to prevent a Palestinian state?
Yeah, sure. He deliberately and systematically even told, is on record, whoever wants to avoid the threat of a two-state solution has to support my policy of paying protection money to the Hamas.
So what we did, with the permission of our Prime Minister, is to let Qatar to transfer a huge amount of money in cash, probably more than $1.4 billion. By doing it, we increased the power of Hamas. We did everything in order to make sure that Hamas will go on controlling Gaza, and Palestinian Authority will control the West Bank, so they will fight each other.
Please don't insult the United States. We don't have a Hannibal directive. All right? October 7th was a military defeat. October 7th was where the Hamas came across the border and took you by surprise. They killed nearly 400 Israeli military personnel. The remaining people, about 800, the majority of them were killed by you. You and your military who hunted them down because of the Hannibal Directive. We now know that the vast majority of Israeli civilians killed on October 7th were killed by the IDF, by Apache helicopters, by tanks, by your own soldiers. The Israelis say as they were driving us, the hostages, as they were driving us back into Gaza, we were attacked by helicopters. One lady, you killed my husband, you killed my child, I was wounded. We know the Israelis slaughtered their own people. Benjamin Netanyahu, do not equate America with that, because as bad as we are, we don't kill our own people, you son of a bitch.